All right, well, welcome back from vacation. I hope everyone had a great summer. It's good to be back in the saddle. We got lots to do tonight and in the next couple months, so busy, I think, time approaching us. But the first item on the agenda is the bonds for George Mason High School. Mr. Shields, you want to?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council. And it's good to be back. It's nice to have some time off in August. So the first item is the amendment to the public improvement bonds for George Mason High School. And in a nutshell, what we have discussed for a matter of years is to finance the high school in two major tranches. Three, really, but the two big ones for construction would be a $60 million issuance this year and a $50 million issuance next June or July. The initial plan was to do the first issuance in June of this year, so we're 6 months behind that for the reasons that we discussed through the summer. The proposal tonight is to issue the full debt for the high school this fall, as opposed to in two tranches, as we've discussed previously. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Bawa for a discussion about the pros and cons of that. We're also joined by Joe Mason from Davenport LLC, who's been our advisor throughout the financing for the high school and the entire CIP, and he will add his thoughts on it as well. Our recommendation is to proceed with the sale in one tranche, and we'll lay out the reasons for that, but we expect a good discussion about that strategy, particularly because we've, for several years now, we've thought about breaking it into two pieces. Kieran.
Good evening, Mayor Tarter and members of the council. As you may recall, just to build up a little bit on what Mr. Shields just mentioned, in May of earlier this year, resolution was brought forward to council for issuance, authority to issue the second tranche for $76,465,000, which would have funded the first piece of construction to get us through next summer. And that included over $60 million for the school project, along with funding for library and a couple other capital projects. We are requesting for a full issuance for the high school for the remaining amount of $110 million, and adding the library and other projects, the fire station and park master implementation, sewer and stormwater, as part of the CIP for a total issuance, consolidated issuance of $126,825,000. This is to take advantage of the favorable low interest rates that we're seeing right now. And also, analysis has been performed by Davenport and also by city staff. The city's debt service metrics, as per the financial policy that we have, remain in compliance with a larger issuance that includes full funding for the school project. The debt service to expenditure ratio by the policy should remain below 15%, and that is the case with this larger amount, and also the total debt would still be less than the 5% of the assessed value for this. We are expecting that to close this by early November of this year. And the debt for this high school would be a 30-year level debt, and all other projects would be a 20-year level principal debt. And the debt service, the structuring of these bonds would be such that the debt service for fiscal year 20 would be within the budgeted amount that we brought to council as part of the fiscal year 20 budget. And we have used the projected debt service numbers that we received from the analysis from Davenport and put in our model to make sure how it impacts our capital reserves. We are still in a position to meet the city's capital reserve policy, as well as the cash flow that we would get from the West Falls Church project. So it meets the requirements of the model that was done earlier. With that, I'll conclude and open to questions that you may have for Davenport or us staff.
All right, thank you very much for that information. I imagine there are a fair amount of questions. Thank you, Mr. Mason, for joining us tonight and for your good work over these past years.
Pleasure.
Is there anything do you have any statements you want to make before we kind of get into questions and the like?
No, I think the manager and the CFO covered it very well. I guess one just added thought. Interest rates are at incredible lows right now. I mean, no one can say what's exactly going to happen between now and the time we bring these bonds to market. But it's truly a unique opportunity to potentially lock in the entirety of the remaining CIP at rates that are a multiple below your planning level. So that was the big impetus to get us to look at it at least. And that's what I'd say. And I'm happy to answer any questions I might be able to.
So is that your recommendation, that we go ahead and do the issuance at one fell swoop?
Yes, I mean, I think there's some efficiencies from a staff standpoint. There's the ability to lock in a low rate. Yes, interest rates could, in theory, always come down further, but they are at really extraordinary lows right now. The one thing you take off the table is an unexpected spike in interest rates. So if you split this back into two issues and did one this fall and one next summer, you would be exposed to rising interest rates. Now, do we see in the current economic news that that's a high likelihood? But nobody has a perfect crystal ball in terms of interest rate direction. One could envision a reconciliation with China, for example, that might drive rates up. So if you can lock it in at a really low rate, our recommendation is to go ahead and do that. The rating agencies already expect all of this debt coming down because you've already told them what your plans are and what you're going to do. All you're doing is moving the timing of a portion of it up to take advantage of a good market interest rate environment, and I think they're going to think that's a good strategic move.
I would think it's probably some less risk as well because our payments are lower. In other words, with the lower interest rate, our payments are technically lower than they would be otherwise.
You modeled this whole program at a rising level as we move through time. I think the first issue was 3.5, and then we bumped to 4.5 for the second two, maybe even 5 for that third one. And as I said, you're going to be able to lock it in for significantly less than that. So you've taken already a fair amount of the risk off the table.
What is the interest rate if we were going to put that out right now, let's say today, to 20 and a 30-year? What would the rates be at those approximately?
The 20-year level principal portion, which is the smaller share, would probably, for your AAA ratings, would probably go down at about 2 to 2.25% at most.
For 20 years?
20 years, and the 30-year piece will be closer to 3.
And we modeled 3.5, 4, and 4.5.
That's right.
And so what kind of savings would that be to the city approximately? I don't know, maybe Kieran, you might be better able to answer that. Well, I want to hear it. I want the public to hear it as well.
We had projected a total issuance of, over the life of the bond, if we model at 3% now and 3% and 4% next year, is a saving of roughly $10 million over the life of the bond between those two.
Between 3 and 4?
Yeah.
I thought we modeled up to 4.5 in the second.
We modeled 4.5 and 5
Okay.
for existing debt.
She's referring to the analysis that we did where we
The
took
two
that
tranches.
5% down to about 4% for next year, just because rates have come down so much, still factoring in the possibility of an increase. But that 100 basis point difference between 3% and 4% on the long piece, and a little less than that on the 20-year piece, translates, as Ms. Bawa said, to $10 million in interest cost savings, which is not insignificant.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
So remind me again what the interest rate was on the 30-year for the first tranche that we took out. Wasn't that just over a
It
little
was
3%?
close to 3, yeah, 3.1, something like
Okay,
that.
so we're not that far off where we just bonded previously.
You talking
Saying
about
we're
the
going to
30-year
do
piece?
30-year at around 3%. We just bonded the first tranche at just over 3%, correct?
I don't have the number in front of me, but I'm being
Right.
conservative when I tell you 3%.
So the savings are really against the benchmark from the original estimates that we had, not based on the comparison against the previous, correct? So when you say $10 million in savings, that was based on what we had originally budgeted, but we did our most recent tranche underneath that interest rate, correct?
Roughly,
Those
yes.
are
Okay.
short-term notes.
So what are on the flip side of that, so I get the 10 million, so it's cost savings against what we estimated, if it was 4 or 5%, whatever, totally get that. But we already knew, at least in current environment, assuming nothing changed from the previous tranche, that we should have been lower than that estimate. What are the costs of bonding earlier than we had previously assumed. Because we're accelerating debt service payments, right? We're starting sooner, correct?
Yeah, you're effectively, you are paying interest for, in this case, 5 or 6 months ahead of when you would have expected to, when you take on the new borrowing next year. Yeah, that's an extra interest payment, but it's in your budget, so.
But even on top of that, if I could interrupt, we can put that money in one of the vehicles we have, which will get, I'm guessing, about 2% anyway, right? Like a VML vehicle for the interim period?
Yeah, we put it in the SNAP fund. Typically, we have to protect against arbitrage.
Yeah, so I mean, but that,
regulation.
what's that
Yeah.
putting out? Probably 2% right now anyways,
It's
correct?
about 2.5, 2.5.
So, I mean, we're pretty nearly making
Yeah,
ourselves
no,
whole
my
on
line
that.
of questioning was going to what's just the overall net impact, right? Apples to apples, accelerating it, but also assuming that we were going to get the lower debt anyway. And if you've got some investment where we're parking it and earning interest, what's the net impact in the short term to what we were budgeting in terms of cost, carrying cost?
I want to make sure I understand your question. Are you talking in comparison to the modeling we had done or to the 3 and 4% that we're talking now?
So if we bonded at 3%, things haven't gotten worse, or 3.15, it was somewhere close to that when we did the previous bonding. We were expecting to bond the second tranche a little bit later. At the just over 3%, accelerating interest payments, parking it in escrow or in some interest-bearing account, what's the net increase in carrying cost to us over this time difference between when we're bonding earlier than we thought?
Well, it's negligible because you're bonding earlier. I mean, normally, well, go back a year or two before short-term rates decided that they were going to go up. You'd be borrowing 100 plus million and paying whatever your rate is, your borrowing rate, but you were turning around and investing those proceeds as the project expenditures were done, but you weren't earning anything when rates were at a quarter point or half a point. Now, because of the yield curve being relatively flat, you are borrowing at a long-term capital rate and can turn around and, even if you borrowed it early, you can turn around and park that money, as you said, and earn nearly the long-term cost of capital while the funds are spent. Is that getting at your point or your question?
Let me ask it a different way. What were the monthly interest payments that we were expecting on a tranche estimated at, call it, the 4% that we modeled? What were those costs on a monthly basis?
But your question, if I'm following your thread, is we modeled with certain assumptions. What is now, where the market is today, is better than those assumptions. So you want to know the delta between
I
what
want
we
to
modeled
know.
and what.
So I want to know So the model that we did with 4%, that was out the window when we did the first tranche, right? We had assumed a higher interest rate. We took advantage of.
Well, the first tranche was at 3.5.
That's right, but didn't you just say that we modeled at 4
So,
months?
so where we're losing your thread is we had 3 tranches. We made an assumption about the first one, which has already been issued, that was issued a year ago,
Right.
year and a half ago. So what we're now talking about is tranche 2 and tranche 3. Tranche 2 we modeled at,
4.5.
tranche 3 we
At
modeled
5.
at 5. So that's what we modeled.
Okay.
And compared to that modeling, this getting 126 million at 3% today will save well over 20 million over the 30-year window. And the rate that we got for the first issuance in summer of 2018 that you asked for, it was, we average it out 20-year, 5-year, and the 30 years. So that averaged out at 3.1, 3.17. I think that, if my memory serves me right, it was somewhere between 3 and 3/4, depending on and that only included 6.5 million for the school project. This one includes a lot more on the school project compared to the total issuance.
Okay. Let me just clarify this. What is the monthly carrying cost on the interest for this tranche? Because we're bonding this earlier than we had normally expected. What is that monthly carrying cost?
So the pinch point has always been 2021. That's the year that we get lease payment number 2, and so in every modeling scenario, that was always the point of tension. And so I think your question is, now this does increase that point of tension. So can we discuss that? Because there is, with this approach, there is some structuring of the debt where we'd push some principal payments out in order to protect yourselves against that 2021 pinch point. And perhaps we could provide just a little bit
Sure.
of information about
Sure.
that.
So comparing issuing the full amount now versus one tranche now at 3% and a second tranche next summer at 4%, our debt service for this year would be like $1.5 million more for fiscal year 20, and it would be $1.5 million more for fiscal year 21. Was modeled at 14. Well, actually, it's about 900,000. It's modeled at 13.8, and then we'd come to 14.7 million. The fiscal year 20, we are in a position to absorb the increase in the debt service given the interest rate, because we had modeled at a 4.5%, and based on that, we budgeted an amount, and we are able to make within that budget the issuance for the interest and the principal for the larger amount in that.
When you say we're able to, we can account for the extra 1 to 1.5, where is that money coming from?
From the budgeted debt service that we have in fiscal year 20,
So from the operating,
which was which was in the non-departmental, which was budgeted based on the modeling that we had done.
so for FY21, you're saying if we do merge tranche 2 and 3, we'd pay 1 to 1.5 million more in debt service, but because we're expecting to bond at a higher interest rate,
At a
So-
lower rate now.
and then now we're at a lower rate, you'd be able to cover the amount of debt service.
Exactly.
Let me ask you this, though. Did you model any income on the additional borrowing at the earlier time? In other words, if we get 2.25% or whatever VML or whatever the name of the fund is, did you model that income against the additional payments?
No, our operating income includes investment earnings, but on unassigned fund balance and capital reserves that we have, but not on the bond proceeds.
Because we're paying service earlier on more, but we're also, you should counterbalance
Exactly,
that with the fact
we did
that,
not.
'cause I mean,
Also,
in some ways, it's negligible, right? If we're going to borrow
exactly.
at 3%, is that a blended rate between the 20 and 30, or is that pure on the 30, the 3% you're estimating?
On 30.
So you got some of that's blended out at 2.25, right, on 20%, on 20-year debt?
Right.
So it may almost be a wash if you figure out you can earn 2.25, let's say, on whatever the fund is called, the VML fund. And then you also save on transaction costs, right? Because you're only issuing one tranche as opposed to 2, right?
That's correct.
So, I mean, it seems to me that those factors should actually push that $1.5 million a pretty good amount lower than they are. That's just eyeballing it.
That's
Is that-
correct. That's correct. Yeah.
So could maybe you provide those numbers to us, including the savings or the income from the income on the fund and also the reduced transaction costs, so we can sort of have a,
Sure.
okay. Vice Mayor Conley?
You just mentioned.
Can I just
Yeah.
continue this?
Yeah,
Because
of
you're talking
course.
about the answer that I want.
Okay.
Can somebody tell me what the interest payments are on this tranche versus what we had initially estimated at this particular point in time? So now we're combining second and third tranche. So based on the timing, so if we're going to bond everything all together, what is that payment versus what we had expected? And I also don't look at this, to be honest with you, as like potentially $10 million in savings, because I would have imagined that our modeling would have changed after we bonded at the lower rate, because we expected a higher interest rate, but in the environment that we're in, we bonded this most recent amount at just over 3%. So this is not technically, in my mind at least, $10 million in savings, unless we're still modeling against an interest rate that frankly is not something that we're going to see at any point, at least over the next 12 months, after we knew what we bonded that first amount at. My assumptions?
I tend to not make interest rate predictions. That's certainly a reasonable assumption that rates are not going to shoot up over the course of the next month. We did pull the rate for the second tranche, or the third tranche, second assuming you do 2 more as opposed to a single one, we brought it down from 5 to 4. So, and the delta between what you're likely to actually get and the 4 is the $10 million we're speaking about. So if we were back at the 5, I don't have that number with me, but it's in the modeling that staff did. It's going to be significantly larger than $10 million.
Okay. I guess the point that I'm making is I'm just trying to get an understanding of if I was modeling all of the debt that we were expecting to bond, whether it was in a second and third tranche versus one, my apples to apples comparison would be at the most the interest rate that we just bonded on versus the payments associated with that versus accelerating this to do it all in one package against the interest rate that you're expecting. That's the net that I want to know, not the we're saving $10 million because we're benchmarking against an interest rate that's not realistic because we've already come in under that interest rate in the most recent tranche.
The 10 million is nothing to do with the first tranche. The 10 million is only to account for the second tranche alone, like a large one, or second and third tranche. If we were to account for the first tranche savings and also a saving as a result of the second and the third tranche, the number would be much larger.
Yeah.
I think the concern is that the math used to come up with the 10 million savings is based on modeling at 4.5% or 5%,
No, 3 and 4.
3 and 4. But we just issued debt at 3.1, right?
Yes, but we don't, with all due respect.
Didn't remodel.
Interest rates, I mean, they've just dropped 50 basis points in the last 6 weeks. They could easily go back up 0.5% or to 1%. If you go back to the Great Recession, and everybody's saying we're going to have, other difficulties in the credit markets. When the credit markets froze up in 2009, interest rates shot up. I'm not saying these things are going to happen, but when we model, and particularly when we go back in time to when the city, this body, was trying to determine whether or not it had the financial wherewithal to take on a project of this magnitude, we purposefully built a level of conservatism in there because we didn't know where interest rates were going at the time, and we wanted to be doubly sure that that you did, between the combination of your own ability from your own tax base in concert with the West Falls Church development project, that there was going to be enough cash flow even if interest rates went up. Because once you start building the school, you can't stop if interest rates jump by 100 basis points throughout your 3-year assumption cycle. So that's why they were built. Now, certainly there's a fair criticism to be made that maybe we didn't take the estimates down enough, but we did take 100 basis points down on that third tranche. But again, we didn't want to push the envelope too much, because then if we come back and say to you, hey, we thought it was going to be 3, but it was 3.5, then none of us feel particularly good about it.
Okay. Yeah, so the last request that I'll make is if someone could tell me, if you were to model out the second and third tranche, if you were to look at what that cost would have been based on the interest rate that we were able to achieve with the most recent, and then what the net cost or benefit is with that compared with what we're doing now. Taking into consideration the VML 2.25% income that we would earn in addition to accelerating the debt payments. Because what I don't want to do is go out and say, hey, we just bonded all of this together faster than we told you we were going to bond it, and we're saving you $10 million, because that's, in my opinion, that's not the whole story. So I want to make sure I understand what the actual net cost and benefit is using assumptions on what was going to be a second and third with an interest rate that's closer to what we just bonded. Because if we were to run it against estimates that were 5%, it'd be significantly higher than 10 million. But if it's less, and what was more realistic with the most recent issuance that we had, it's going to be less than that. And then we're accelerating payments. We're also earning income. So I just want to know what that number is. That's what I'm asking. And it doesn't have to be done on paper tonight, but that's what I'm interested in knowing.
Well, I guess we could model with all sorts of different interest rates. It seems to me the crux of the matter is what happens in 2021. That's the crux. It always has been the crux. It still is the crux. we are issuing more debt, so we have more tension on 2021, and so that's mitigated. We've always been modeled very conservatively, so it is further mitigated by the investment returns we're getting into, and we've never modeled that income, and so that is a fact that makes our model able to accommodate, things being delayed or whatever the case may be on the economic development front. But in 2022, we're going to be paying exactly the same interest rate whether we issue it all today or we issue it in 2 tranches. So once you get past 2021, this isn't really, the difference on the interest rates. We could model all sorts of different assumptions there. And I get a little worried about trying to model things with a whole lot of different assumptions as you're suggesting. Are you doing that simply to try to do an apples to apples comparison?
Well, I'm doing it to figure out what the cost benefit is because we're bonding more than we had initially expected and earlier than we had messaged to people. So I want to understand what that cost benefit is.
So you're saying the risk of borrowing, you want to know a little bit more about the risk of borrowing sooner.
We were effectively borrowing more earlier than we said we were going
Of
to borrow.
course,
And
yeah.
that should raise concerns. I'm not saying it's going to be a non-starter, but that's something that I would like to see the numbers behind before saying, you know what, we're going to go ahead and bond everything now and borrow money that we told you we weren't going to borrow now as opposed to later. And I just want to understand those benefits as opposed to this kind of nebulous $10 million that we're saying we're saving. That's what I'm saying. It's a big number. It's a big number.
So
I totally get it. I mean, I think the flip side of that is the risk that interest rates might go up. And so I think there's sort of 2 things we're balancing here. One is, as you say, the concern about, look, we shouldn't borrow any money until we absolutely need it, I think is what kind of the subtext is what you're saying. And then the other side of that is it's really cheap right now and interest rates may go up and that may cost us money for the next 30 years. And so that's kind of the other side of that. And that's, I don't know if there's
I'm not saying it's a bad, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. I just want to know what the actual cost benefit of it is in a realistic modeled scenario.
So essentially what we're doing is we're borrowing 6 months later the second tranche, and we're doing 6 months earlier the third tranche. We did a short-term note in June to keep us afloat on the cash flow, but for a very small amount
Right.
comparatively.
It's a timing issue.
Exactly. So it's not that you are borrowing a year or plus in advance. This is, by the time we close, it is going to be early November. We were expected to go for the third tranche in April, spring. So we're literally 5 to 6 months apart. And to save on transaction costs and other efficiencies that are involved, trips and this and that, rating agencies, it would come to an advantage to us. I understand you want the number, but we'll get to that for next
Well, I
time.
think the number is pretty easy to get. I mean, I think the request, as I understand it, is quite simple. So on one hand, you have a 6 months acceleration and then 6 months delay. I certainly understand the fundamental feeling that we know what we know now, and if we can take that element of risk off the table, we know what we pay, and yeah, we're going to be paying off a debt for money that we don't need for a short period of time. I'm not sure what signal it's going to send to our population. I think half will see that we're doing the job that we promised to do, which is to mitigate the risk. The other half will see that we don't know what we're doing and indulging in speculation, whereas the future could be more advantageous to any actions that we might take.
Mm-hmm.
Look, the Federal Reserve, no one's is able to predict what they're going to do, and moreover, whether the rates go down or go up, it sometimes has the opposite effect. We know that as well. We know that the world right now is sitting on a mountain of debt, and it could obviously affect the credit markets if there is some major perturbation in the run-up to next year's election. I think that's kind of the underlying fear here, that we don't really know what's going to happen. And it could be much worse. It could be much better, but it could be much worse. So if we take that element of risk off the table, then we know what we have going forward. I don't really have a big request for numbers. I think that, this is more of a qualitative decision that we have to make. If you're gonna quantify for all of us here, I think the bit of eyewash with respect to saving potentially $10 million is something that people are going to say, how did you get to that? And then you start to unravel this argument, and then it's, again, speculation. But I do agree, you've been very conservative with the numbers here. And I also would agree that if you had modeled it at 2.5, 2.75 to 3.5, and it came in much more, that we would have had you for breakfast the next day. So, I think coming forward at this point, our consultants and our CFO had all summer to do nothing but look at screens as the rest of us went on vacation and had a great time, is to come back to us and say, okay, it's September, let's figure out what we do going forward. So if we can come up with a more finite set of numbers that would, first of all, satisfy Mr. Lickenhouse here, but moreover would allow all of us here to provide the merits of paying debt for money that we don't need yet. That's really the argument we need to make. Thank you.
All right, so we got a lot of questions, and I probably spoke before I should have. Why don't we go Ms. Hardy, and then Vice Mayor, and then Mr. Snyder, then Mr. Duncan, if he's got anything.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this recommendation. So generally, I think I approach these things by thinking of only taking out debt when we need it. And so I jumped to line 76, which shows the full 127 million. So out of that, which ones are actually needed now that would have been in tranche 2? And which ones would have been in tranche 3?
So the only thing that's in addition over here is 50,800,000 for tranche 3 for high school project.
So take the 95.5 and split that in half. Only
Correct.
50 of it wouldn't be needed until next year. So
Correct,
that's
till April.
So that's the amount that we would be essentially taking out debt early for
Right.
the sake of interest rates.
Yeah,
Um,
and just for a smaller amount, this includes 150,000 for the Fire Station 6 reinvestment and Park Master Plan implementation, 150,000 that are approved in the fiscal year 20 budget, but not issued. Since we're going for a consolidated, we added those in.
So was that planned for tranche 3 or tranche 2?
It was planned for tranche 3, I guess. Tranche 2 has been delayed. So if you look at it that it was for fiscal year 19 projects, then it was not planned. But if you think of it as accelerating the fiscal year 20 projects, because the budget is already adopted, then it was part of it.
So with the
That's the
exception of
idea.
this small handful of things, it's really 50 million for the high school.
That's correct.
Wouldn't be needed till next summer. We're proposing that we bond that early, 9 months early.
That's correct, yeah,
Because we think interest rates are really good right now.
that's correct.
I think my second concern, is generally, it's really hard for anyone to predict interest rates, especially when you think you're heading into a potential national recession. Everyone keeps talking about usually interest rates go down in that scenario. So I think that would be my other initial concern. In the calculation that Mr. Lickenhouse asked, I think this is what the mayor also talked about too, is can we get the numbers for potential savings and issuance fees? I imagine if we combine the two, you might get some savings and not having to do it twice. So that should be included in there. So talking about 2021, being that the pinch point, I know we've stared at lots of charts and graphs around what the debt service expense ratios look like. We also did a series of stress testing. So by moving $50 to $60 million in debt early, what does that stress test now look like for 2021? Does that make us more vulnerable? Because I think the stress test essentially showed that we could account for a delay of that payment by 1 to 2 years, if I remember correctly.
So we are still able to handle a 2-year delay with the current consolidated debt, and that was the stress test that we had done for a separate 2-tranche issuance, and this consolidated spending would allow for same amount of delay, 2 years.
Okay. So asked it differently, I think I read in the staff report that in either scenario, we'd be exceeding our original 12% debt to expenditure ratio.
That's true.
How much debt do you have based on your annual operating budget? By how much are we exceeding in either scenario?
Uh,
1 3/4 to 2.5%.
So we'd be at 13 and a half
13.75
versus
to
like 14 and a half.
Yeah.
Okay.
You stay under the 15. You come closer to it with the single issuance scenario. The difference is about that 0.75%. But it comes down very quickly after that.
it's 14.2 versus 14.5 in fiscal year 21, which is the crux year.
And then similar to Mr. Lickenhouse's earlier question, so if we stayed with 3 different tranches, let's say in tranche 2 we issue this November at this low, 3% or so, what would we have done with the savings in debt service based on what we budgeted?
We would come back to council as part of the year end, and as your CFO, my recommendation would be to put it back into the capital reserve.
So we planned for extra money in the budget for a higher interest rate, but then we didn't need it after all. Is that what we did last year too with tranche 1?
Well, we haven't come back to you with the year end,
Is that what you're going to
but
do?
we're anticipating some savings because we did issue at a slightly less interest rate than we had modeled.
The thing I'm trying to also balance my mind is as we talk about things like all the walkability improvements that we want to do, stormwater improvements, do we take out debt earlier and take on a lot more debt early for things that we may not need yet for 9 months early, or do we get to some other things that we talk about wanting to do too, right? So I think I'll stop with that there. Thank you.
I want to go to the vice mayor now.
Thank you. So Ms. Hardy asked 2 of my questions, so that'll save us some time. But can you just back up? When did we issue the first tranche?
In May of 2018,
May 2018, and we issued 12 million?
23 million.
23 million.
And of which 6.5 million was for the school project for the design phase.
Okay. And what was the interest rate on that?
If I remember correctly, it was around 3.2, 317. I think
Okay.
that's what my memory says.
Okay. Then in June, we issued the $20 million bridge.
Right.
Right.
June of 19.
June of 19. So that's the first time we really had a look at how good the interest rates were. So the first tranche, we didn't have any sense that the modeling might be a little bit different. So our first look at how good the interest rates were this past June on this bridge loan.
That's correct.
Okay.
Well, but the bridge loan, you're borrowing it at the short end of the yield curve, whereas for the full school project, you're borrowing it over 30 years.
It's a
So the
short-term
interest
loan.
rates
it's
are
not a
not
Right.
long-term.
Right. So but I'm just, Mr. Lickenhouse's questions about changing the modeling and when we had different interest rates. I'm just trying to figure out when we knew that it might be better. And it was just recently. So this is like our really first set of modeling based upon the new interest rate numbers that we have. Right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then we will be repaying the $20 million bridge loan immediately
That's the intent.
once, okay. And then will the rating agencies look favorably at this, that we are consolidating debt?
It's my experience that if you're going to save yourself money, you've already told them that you're committed to doing this entire CIP. If you can save yourself a significant sum of money, potentially, by locking it relative to your planning estimate. It's all
Right.
relative to the planning estimate, because they affirmed or raised you to AAA and affirmed your AAA ratings, knowing that you're going to borrow $161 million. We showed them the modeling, we showed them the interest rate assumptions in the modeling, and they said, we're okay with that.
Yeah.
And now if we can come in significantly under that, that takes risk off from a budgetary cash flow perspective, so they would have no reason to be anything other than neutral to favorable.
Okay. And then with this, if we do 126 million right now, then when would be the next time we need to bond? 'Cause don't we do a little bit every year, right?
Hopefully
Would this
not.
eliminate the need to bond for several years?
Well, at least we would not need to do the fiscal year 20 issuance, and the fiscal year 20 CIP would govern based on what we need for smaller projects.
So but next spring when we're doing the 2021 CIP,
We would not.
we can assume that there won't be more things put in there at that point. if we do come up with things that we need, would we still have the ability to do smaller bonding at that point, like we usually do?
We
or-
could, we possibly, I'm thinking if it's smaller needs, it would be a bank qualified kind of
Okay.
Funding at
Okay.
that point, and we may not have to go for a full issuance.
So this doesn't completely tie our hands to not doing any more bonding in 2021.
Oh, it doesn't, no.
Thank you.
I would just, if I may jump in and say, I would think that for the next, and we talked about this, given the magnitude of the debt you're taking on, I mean, smaller projects here and there that could potentially be direct bank loans, things of that nature. But until you've had a chance to absorb this large amount of debt for a few years, 3 to 5 years, and the cash flows from the economic development project are coming to fruition, I would just caution against taking on too much more.
That sounds reasonable. Thanks.
So actually, I heard that as a very different response than Ms. Bawa's response. So I heard you say, no, we can definitely, take on more debt. And then I heard Mr. Mason say, well, actually, I would caution, if you're going to take out $120 million now, I would caution throwing in a $5 million in FY 2021, right? Unless you actually get the cash flows come in 2021 and start relieving that pinch point.
I think you've got by executing your plan of finance for the high school and the other projects at significantly below your planning estimates, you've got some room to run in terms of borrowing more. What I was alluding to is, if it's a series of projects that add up to $3, $4, $5 million, that's one thing. But a major new initiative that's going to be 15 or 20 million was what I was suggesting. I should have been more clear about it, but what I was suggesting that that's probably something you don't want to go to the rating agencies, because we basically told them this is the big stuff that we're investing in, and that's going to be it in terms of major investments for a while. So every time you go there, they ask you what your future borrowing plans are, and if you surprise them with a tens of millions of dollars project that wasn't on the radar screen, that's going to be a different level of questioning than them doing annual surveillance and seeing you've done a bank loan for $3 or $4 million.
And based on our full CIP modeling that we did earlier, we do not, we anticipated the TJ in 2025, 26 that year. So until then, we have CIP projects, but not anything in the large magnitude.
FY '21 is showing 1.1 million adopted CIP for Wrexham Park and Fire Station, basically smaller projects.
Mr. Snyder, did you have something you wanted to say?
I do. Thanks a lot. Good discussion, and thanks for bringing this proposal forward. So a couple quick questions. What's the impact? I think you answered the impact on the tax rate in FY 2020 as being we're able to absorb the additional. How about FY 2021 and FY 2022?
The total debt service?
Yes. What is the impact on the tax, the amount that we would need to put into the tax rate in 2021, FY 2021 and 2022 with this proposal versus the original plan?
So this one consolidated issuance now is within the 5-cent increase that we did for the full CIP, and is not going to have any impact on the tax rate
Okay.
based on the
thanks.
modeling that we had done.
Okay. The second question really goes to the relatively small amount for stormwater. We know at this point we're going to need to invest significantly more in stormwater infrastructure. Doesn't it make sense to get a number on that and either include it in this or follow up very quickly? That's a policy question. It's not technically a numbers question, but we know that we're going to need to invest in infrastructure. It's climate driven, whatever there are repetitive issues, so doesn't it make sense to try to deal with that now because we know it's a now issue?
It's a good question. Let me just describe the plan. The plan is to do the engineering and the cost estimates this year and ask the council to consider the projects and the costs with the budget next year. So I would recommend that the financing for those improvements be done once we have those projects identified and budgeted, and then we finance them.
If I may add, additionally, the debt service that we have set in for those two funds allows for the amount of debt that we're issuing. Now, if we had to issue any more, I mean, it involves doing the study on the rates and then seeing how much larger amount of debt we can issue for the additional projects as well.
If I could add one more thing. So stormwater fees is what's under study right now. You shouldn't necessarily think of your CIP and general, what I'll call tax supported debt, that debt funded largely by your property tax rate. Don't necessarily think of them as categorically the same as stormwater. Stormwater is a separate impervious surface area fee. You don't need to go to the public bond markets to do that. You could go to, for example, the Virginia Resources Authority, which is a state agency that does these types of projects, both water and sewer utility. In fact, I believe at one point, we may not still, but at one point the city had loans out to VRA, and you could give VRA a pledge of your stormwater revenue and secure the bonds that way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if you had to do more stormwater investment that it would crowd out your ability to do anything else on the tax supported side.
So what you're suggesting is alternative sources of financing other than just putting it into the, into this.
That's correct.
Interesting.
Right, and
Okay.
VRA is rated, they have a senior subordinate structure, but they're rated AAA, AA plus by the rating agencies, so you'll do well with them as well.
Okay,
Yeah, my question was the same about when it rains next week and the city floats away as it has done, recently. They're going to be paying attention to that, and they will think it's all right that we're going to have to at least move at the pace that the manager suggests, if not faster, to identify, projects that need to be done and some way to do them, and that we're going to finance those through, some mechanism that's backed up by the stormwater fee. That's not going to count against us on the other tax-supported debt as far as our ratings.
There are several local governments throughout the U.S. that have issued bonds backed by stormwater, and as long as they're self-supporting from those revenues, in other words, the fees are structured in such a way that after paying operations of the stormwater division, they can also cover its debt service by at least, in VRA's case, 115%, then they'll be deemed self-supporting by the rating agencies. Not all categories of debt fit that bill, but pure revenue bonds do. They're not considered tax supported. They're supported by effectively a user fee.
A fee, right, okay. In a smaller but similar vein, the City Hall Public Safety renovation number of $350,000, can we get some assurances before we vote on this that will be sufficient to solve whatever problems linger or issues or unfinished business lingers from the City Hall construction project, so that at some point in the definable future, holes and plugs and various other things that need to be tended to will be tended to with that amount of money? Is $350,000 enough to do what needs to be done?
The $350,000 represents the contract that the council approved back at the beginning of this project. If you'll recall, we added certain features to the project, the window wells for the IT room and that type of thing. So that's what this $350,000 is for. It is our intention and it is our plan to handle any other change orders or cost increases through the operating budget.
Okay, well, I guess that's what we're gonna do. I understand why. I suppose it's just technically an operating expense, but, you know, it's a capital project, and just concerned that we're gonna endure a long period of time where City Hall isn't quite finished as we'd hoped, because we are always in competition with other things to, you know, finish it up. I don't know if anybody else feels that way, but that's where I feel on that. So, just a couple other things. So on line 65, my understanding of what this says is everything we've talked about, you reserve the right to tell us, you know, didn't really mean it. If we get to the day before the issuance and for some reason interest rates have changed and you want to revert, it's in your judgment then to revert back to the two-tranche approach, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so nothing I'm gonna do is really gonna alter what your judgment is gonna be, because that's a decision that sounds like you would just make on the fly. I mean, council wouldn't necessarily even be involved in that decision if it happens the day before the bonds are issued.
Well, the intent is that we're getting your authority to do one issuance. However, if it works out that the markets are in a condition that are not favorable to us, then we have the option to revert back to your original authority to issue in 2 tranches.
Okay, so that's, I think, what I said. Last question. So on line 121, your estimate of the available fund balance, which may be no less than 15% of expenditures as of June 30th, 2018, was 35%. I presume you're going to be coming pretty soon with a June 30, 2019?
Yes, on September 16th.
On September 16th. So any sneak preview of what that number is looking like?
On September 16th.
Yeah, all right, okay, hold your breath. Yeah.
I'll have a trailer and then the whole movie.
That's right. All right, well,
What would you like the number to be?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I can tell you that for sure. Okay, well, you know, thank you to everyone for thrashing through all the details of this, so the public will understand that we do look at things closely. My choice in trying to explain this to the average person at the door who doesn't want to listen to a long speech is that because council has been wise in pursuing a ambitious program of capital improvements across the board, schools, city hall, library, et cetera, because we've been prudent in our conservative estimates about what interest rates would be, and because we've been fortunate. Combination of wisdom, prudence, and good fortune puts us where we are today. And, you know, you can call it $10 million whatever you want. I could call it, you know, I just bought you a free library. But the point of the matter is, if the world had turned out differently, we'd all be sitting here with much longer faces than we have here right now. And so, good work by everybody to get us where we are here tonight. And I think, hopefully, the environment will remain the same. And, you know, when the afternoon comes, you will do what we've talked about here tonight. Thank you.
Mr. Z, we should
So
wrap up pretty soon.
one last question, because the representative from Davenport had mentioned the chaos in the credit markets following the recession, and so it could also, this is triggered by a comment that Mr. Duncan had made with regard to being prudent stewards, and so if he gets asked the question, why don't you wait for the market to crash and then go ahead and bond at that point in time, and your answer to that with regard to your remembrance of the credit chaos would be what?
Well, I mean, we have a fairly recent, within the last decade or thereabouts, example of a severe credit market disruption. I mean, frankly, for a period of weeks, really, nobody could borrow in the public credit markets. And, you know, the one risk, however pinhole risk that might be, is that you, for whatever reason, face a similar set of events when you are ready and needing your next $50 million to complete the high school, and the credit markets have frozen up, or rates have shot up for whatever disruption, war, whatever, that you can't get access to the credit markets at an affordable level. That's the risk. And you either have the wherewithal to, you know, fund those requirements, those cash flow requirements to continue your project from your own resources and then reimburse yourself later, or you don't. And again, it's not a risk people spend a whole lot of time laying awake at night thinking about, but we have a recent example that's within all of our memories that it can happen. So again, the order of prudence and trying to think of plan B, plan C, not just plan A.
All right, why don't we wrap this conversation up? I do have a few comments, a few questions that I'd like to quickly make, but I appreciate our folks, our friends waiting patiently for their turn to get up here. Let me ask you on our interest rates, you kind of alluded that these might be the lowest ever. Is that literally true, the lowest long-term rates?
I won't say lowest ever, but we're pretty doggone close.
Okay. So to me, the kind of question is, it's, as Ross or Mr. Lichtenhouse said, it's the difference between borrowing early, the risk associated with that, and the carry cost associated with that, versus the risk that interest rates might go up or there may be some kind of disruption in the marketplace. It seems to me the risk that interest rates will go lower is, even if the risk or the possibility is high, the magnitude is low. In other words, you're not going to get that much lower. How much lower can interest rates go, right? I mean, they can compress a little bit. They're not going to go more than 2.5% lower because that's zero, right? So
Part of the problem that the Fed has is that they don't have a lot of ammunition.
yeah, but the risk that it can go higher is much more. I mean, like it could be 5%. They could double, which would be a lot, but it's possible. But they're certainly not going to go below zero. And so to me, I think it's kind of just a risk-benefit analysis. And I think generally I'd lean towards taking advantage of very low rates right now and trying to lock them in. But I do think the analysis is appropriate that Mr. Lichtenhouse and others have wanted to see. But I do think, given the fact that we have a pretty good vehicle for investing our money, that there's not a big delta between what we're going to borrow at and our ultimate cost, because we're going to get a pretty good return on our money in the meantime. And so we're maybe talking about 0.5% of carry cost, essentially, or maybe 0.75% of carry cost, given 3% minus 2.25%, whatever we might get on our money, which is fairly minimal. What is the typical loan origination fee? Like, what do they charge in the market to put out debt? Is it a percentage point? Is it less? What's the origination fee generally?
Well, it's in the public credit markets. It's something called an underwriting spread. It's basically the cost you're paying the investment bank to buy your bonds, and I think we had an estimate in here on, 600,000. So that's roughly, we quote it in terms of per bond, and that's about $5 per bond.
So is there savings with doing it in one versus two, or you're essentially paying the same rate whether you do it in one versus two?
It's, I can't speak directly to that because it depends on what's going on in the market that day.
Okay.
How you don't particularly, as the issuer, you don't particularly care what their underwriting spread is. You care about getting the best price for your bonds, and if they want to make a very aggressive bid and want to get compensated for that, as long as they're the winning bidder, you're fine with it because the auction produces the lowest price to you.
Okay.
Excuse me, the highest price, the lowest TIC.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, I think you guys have done a great job explaining things to us. And at the end of the day, I appreciate conservatism in terms of estimating and budgeting. I think our taxpayers do as well. We've had very few, I think, surprises to the bad side through this project. And I think in part because we've had very conservative estimates and conservative tools that we've used to estimate our income and our expenses. And I think that speaks well of the process as well. So anyway, thank you again for your work tonight. I'm sure we'll be talking more with all of you.
And
Is there anything else anybody needs to say or wants to say?
together online analysis. Okay.
All right, let's move on then. All right, so our next item is CACT, is that right? Okay, well, let's bring our folks up from CACT. Welcome and thank you for hanging around.
So we've got 4 seats. David, how are you?
All right, well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you for the fine work you all do day in and day out for the city. We appreciate it. There's a lot going on. Yeah, there's a lot going on in the city. So we're excited. Mr. Shields, I don't know, is there any kind of staff report that you would like to mention briefly before we get into our discussion?
Well, it's good to have the CACT with us, and so the council and the CACT can have a broad discussion, but the specific items that are on the agenda is to discuss a shared mobility devices pilot program, which we call the scooter pilot, and we'll talk about that. And we also have a discussion about walkability and spot. So those are the two things that are listed on the agenda, but of course there can be a broader dialogue since we have the opportunity of everybody being here together.
I think the broader dialogue would be most appreciated as well at some point during our conversation this evening. You guys don't know a whole lot, and there's so much, I think, that still needs to be done. So, but why don't we, do you want us to go ahead and start with your thoughts on scooters and the like?
Well, I've just seen the policy just now, so I remember actually Carrie walk us through it.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't know if Paul, do you want to make any introductory comments before we turn it over to Carrie? But
one, I would say that Carrie's done a great job as managing a lot of the shared mobility programs and multimodal programs in the city, being a key player in winning the $15.7 million grant for multimodal transportation around the West Falls Church project, administering the rollout of the city's capital bike share program with, of course, help from other staff and departments in the city, and now taking on scooters, another hot topic in the region and, of course, the country.
And we did just have a nice groundbreaking last week for the walkability improvements up at the high school, and Carrie was the star of the show for that. So she helped us get that grant. A lot of people did, but Carrie was the author of that grant, and so that was a great morning. So scooter policy, we'll turn it over to you, Ted.
So thank you, Mayor Tarter and members of council and Chair Comont and members of the CICT for the opportunity to speak about this policy tonight. So no formal action is requested at this time. Staff is instead seeking concurrence to prepare the proposed shared mobility pilot program materials, including the memorandum of agreement and the permit application. And formal council action will be requested once program materials are drafted. So there was General Assembly legislation earlier this year, and if a locality does not implement an ordinance or pilot program by January 1st, 2020, shared mobility device companies can operate in that locality as authorized by the state legislation. So in terms of a recommendation, the staff report I prepared provides a draft pilot program city staff has worked on and a summary of key policy items contained in the pilot program proposal. So shared mobility devices include motorized skateboards, scooters, bicycles, or electric power-assisted bicycles. These devices typically are shared among riders, operated by private companies, and are enabled by technology or apps. They're also frequently dockless, meaning that they park in public spaces and lock to themselves in an app. They're frequently used as a first mile, last mile solution to connect to rail transit, and are also used for short trips. And they provide another transportation option and cruise mode choice. In terms of policy guidance for shared mobility devices, expanding these options is generally supported by adopted city policies, including the Mobility for All Modes chapter of the city's Transportation Master Plan, which establishes a vision for expanded transportation mode choice and stronger connections to the regional system. So the General Assembly legislation, which became effective July 1st of 2019, granted localities the ability to regulate the use of motorized skateboards or scooters, bicycles, or electric power-assisted bicycles for hire. localities are not granted the power to ban these devices, but may regulate them. And if a locality does not implement an ordinance or pilot program by January 1st, 2020, shared mobility device companies can operate in that locality as authorized by the legislation. So the devices as addressed in the state legislation for motorized skateboards or scooters, it applies to devices that are, well, it defines them as less than 100 pounds, have a max speed of 20 miles per hour, and are permitted to ride on sidewalks unless prohibited by local ordinance. And then including e-bikes and dockless bikes, so all of the devices have to have both a headlight and taillight. And if less than 14 years old, riders need parental supervision. Also, per city code, riders 14 years of age or younger are required to wear a protective helmet. In terms of regional context, shared mobility devices have been operating in other jurisdictions in the region under various pilot programs, as shown as on page 3 of the staff report. Arlington County and the City of Alexandria programs have been operating for almost a year. Arlington County is seeing around 435 motorized scooters. The City of Alexandria is seeing around 650 to 700 motorized scooters. And the City of Fairfax is seeing around 225 to 250 motorized scooters. None of them are seeing a lot of e-bikes. Those are mostly operating in the district. And then in terms of permit fees, Arlington County has an $8,000 one-time upfront permit fee per company per device type, while the City of Alexandria and the City of Fairfax have a $5,000 fee, and the City of Fairfax also charges a right-of-way use fee of 5 cents per trip. So, looking at pages 5 and 6 of the staff report, and these will be addressed in more detail in the memorandum of agreement that city staff is working on now, redlining from Arlington County's MOA. So in terms of locations permitted to operate, for motorized scooter or skateboard, riding on sidewalks is permitted, but riding on streets is encouraged, except on Route 7 and 29. Devices parked on the sidewalk. Devices may not be parked on the sidewalk in a way that impedes pedestrians or other traffic. And then corral areas will be available for e-scooter parking adjacent to Capital Bike Share stations, in on-street parking spaces, and in other areas as identified. And then companies will be required to provide a kickstand on the device so that the device may be parked upright. For max speed, staff is proposing 10 miles per hour for motorized scooter or skateboard. Headlight and taillight are required, and 14 years of age or younger are required to wear a helmet to operate or ride on the shared mobility device. And over 14 years old, encouraged to wear a helmet. Minimum age for riders, minimum age for an independent rider is 14 years old. Adult supervision is required if under 14 years old. And then in terms of equity and access, the companies will be required to provide an option to purchase rides without the use of a smartphone app, and will be required to provide instructions in English and Spanish. And then for length of the pilot, we are proposing, city staff is proposing 12 months with an option to extend upon agreement with both parties. And this is to allow enough time to look at what we're seeing in terms of the pilot before anything more permanent is put in place. In terms of number of companies, instead of limiting the number of companies, requiring companies to apply for a permit by a specified date. Number of devices, a maximum of 25 devices per device type per company may be deployed in the city per the proposal, with an option to increase the number of devices based on demand and with additional permit fees. And then right-of-way fee of 5 cents per trip, a cash bond that the city may use to pay costs related to removing and storing devices, and then other items like a business license, device decal, data reporting, and customer service requirements. So in terms of the process for applicants, it will include the MOA, a business license, business taxes, permit application, and permit attachments, and then a permit fee and per trip fee.
All right, thank you for that very thorough report. You've done a lot of great work, so we thank you for that. Why don't we turn it on over to our folks at CACT and get the first take on what you've heard tonight. Do you guys have any thoughts?
There. It looks like you've done a lot of work on this, and it looks like a good policy to me. I mean, I like all of the detail that you put together, and the way that you've presented it here is great. I'm really glad to see that we're encouraging this kind of mobility within the city by having a policy. I think that's great. And I'm glad that we're not against people riding on sidewalks. I know that it's not ideal, but it is necessary in the city. So any other reactions or questions? Anybody else?
Are our neighboring jurisdictions permitting sidewalks?
So we're not able to prohibit riding on sidewalks unless we do an ordinance. So our neighboring jurisdictions are allowing it for the most part. Right. Yeah, Arlington does not, but they're sort of not really enforcing that.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it would kind of kill the whole project. Do you know how the max speeds compare to other jurisdictions? Are they lower or are they the same?
Arlington allows 15 miles. Well, actually, I have it all. Some other jurisdictions are allowing.
Slow, but I'm sure if you're on it, it feels quite fast.
Some other jurisdictions are allowing 15 miles per hour. Yeah.
The 10 is from Arlington. Is that correct?
Let me see.
That was my memory from our staff.
Let's see. Yeah, the 10 is from Arlington. And then, yeah, Fairfax City has no maximum speed listed. Fairfax County, though they haven't put anything in place yet, they were proposing 15 miles per hour, but they may reduce it to 10.
And Kara, if I could just add, the staff task force that worked on this includes the chief of police, and part of the speed discussion was for safety, given our tight roads with parking and sidewalks that aren't always best for walkability, let alone scooter ridership. So that, I think, was part of the data points adding to our 10-mile-an-hour recommendation.
Makes sense. I wasn't aware that the companies were able to allow people to purchase rides without a smartphone app. Is that something that they already have in place, or it's a unique requirement that we would have?
Some of the other localities are doing that. I think it's through website. So.
Okay.
And the City of Baltimore I believe, has a cash option.
Dave, do you?
Yeah, sure. I had a few observations. So yeah, this looks great, Carrie, and everybody who worked on it. One thing I was kind of curious about is there, given how closely linked we are with the other jurisdictions, is there any sort of, and given how many of these will start out in the city in the beginning of the day and then somewhere else at the end of the day, is there any sort of requirement that you've seen any of the other jurisdictions have in terms of like a minimum number placed within the jurisdiction at any given morning or point in time, given that they cross jurisdictions so much?
So are you, you're saying in terms of areas within the jurisdiction? Yes. Yeah, so some other localities have like different zones or access zones, and they require a certain percentage or number of scooters to be placed by a certain time of morning, like say 6 a.m. I think for some of them.
Okay. And then I was kind of curious if there was anything that we could do to sort of streamline the permitting so that it's similar to the other jurisdictions, so that ones that are okay in Arlington are okay in Falls Church and vice versa, if they sort of meet similar requirements or can do some sort of like regional permitting.
We're planning to use similar requirements as other jurisdictions and build off the work that's already been done.
Okay. And then as far as the folks go who do the charging, usually at the end of the day, do any of the other jurisdictions do anything in terms of like a minimum wage or a minimum fee that they're paid, or any sort of regulations that they need to adhere to in terms of not blocking traffic to pick up an errant scooter or something like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I could look into that. Yeah.
And then I would just recommend that it's probably worth checking the sidewalks and the streets in the corridors from both of the metro stations, just for those sidewalks that pop up a little bit, because those can create pretty nasty spills on these things. And especially, and Councilman Duncan's a fan of wearing a helmet on these, and I do that when I ride downtown DC. But I know ERs are filling up with folks having accidents on these things as well. And then one other thing I saw in the in the state definitions of the devices, I know out in California there's some they're being called scooters, but it's more of a sit-down scooter. So I haven't seen any of those on the East Coast yet, but it's basically like you have a lower center of gravity, so you're a little more stable, but they can also go a little bit faster. So haven't seen those here, but that might be one thing to keep an eye on as well, if just to make sure we don't have a loophole there. And then I was also curious, I know some of the companies get really persnickety about sharing any data with the city or any jurisdictions where these operate, and I'm curious if there's any sort of data sharing requirement so that we can get a handle on where they're starting and starting and ending.
The reporting.
Oh, okay.
And data sharing. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Cool. All right.
Yeah.
Sean?
Sure. So great job. The only question I had, because everything was already asked and answered, is how did you come up with the number of devices per company? I think it's 25, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, just was wondering where that number came from.
There was a lot of discussion about that number and then the amount for the permit fee. And so that was based on the size of the city is obviously smaller than some of the adjacent jurisdictions. Since there are 7 companies, and we don't know yet who wants to participate, starting it at 25 and then allowing the option to increase the number, staff thought was a good approach to Sort of, yeah. We, we've been approached by Lime, and Jump sent us an email, but we are planning to contact the companies before we.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I think Capital Bike Share, which we already have, which is awesome, I took it over here tonight, is owned by Lime, isn't it?
Capital Bike Share is actually owned by member jurisdictions, so the city owns the bikes and the equipment, and yep.
Okay. There's some relationship though between Capital.
So the city pays Motivate LLC to operate and maintain the Capital Bike Share system. Motivate LLC is a subcontractor to Motivate International, which was purchased earlier this year by Lyft.
That was impressive.
That was impressive.
So.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for those comments. How about on city council side? Questions, comments? Does everyone have some? Why don't we just start with Mr. Z and we'll roll around.
Okay, so let me just say at the outset, I'm in favor of all kinds of modes of mobility. Having just returned from Scandinavia, and in particular the cities of Bergen and Oslo, Norway's had this incredible electric car program for the last 2 years, waiving sales and use and other kinds of taxes and fees, and so on any given street where you actually see vehicular traffic, fully 25-30% of those vehicles are merely brand new electric cars. You rarely see any other cars, and people ride around on bicycles, they walk, on scooters, so it's all pretty remarkable at how little private automobile traffic there is. So having said that, let me just propose a scenario here where one of these Elon Musk rocket scooters from Fairfax City that goes at 35 miles an hour runs over a pedestrian on one of our very wide sidewalks. And since we allow them to ride on sidewalks, I'm just wondering whether there's a liability issue that we're taking on. Who's going to, of course, police this 13-year-old kid on this rocket scooter that's not wearing a helmet? That is now 15 miles away from home. And this kid happens to dump his scooter on the lawn in front of my house with half of it in the street, and I can't park. So there I've offered 5 potential scenarios that I don't know have been addressed. I'm sure you'll develop answers to all of these, but I think there's a lot of concern that we haven't fully fleshed this out yet with regard to allowing them. On the other hand, if we're going to limit the speed of these scooters to 10 miles an hour, we probably won't get any takers here because no one's going to custom tailor a scooter just for this city that travels so slowly. So that might be one way of limiting the uptake. Just a comment. But
Is it a governor that they put on the scooter? And if it's 15 miles in another jurisdiction, they cross over, does the governor kick in and then it goes to 10?
the lieutenant governor kicks in, yes.
Arlington County has the 10 mile per hour, so they must have figured out a way to do it. I'm not sure actually if it.
Probably.
I think the
the anecdotal story about the person who was riding it from Arlington to Falls Church, and when he got to the border, it stopped because it's programmed not to operate in Falls Church. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the answer is they can do that.
So I don't know about the issue of liability, but that is one that concerns me greatly, especially if they ride on our cycle. I hate to see one of our more mature citizens get torpedoed by one of these things. So I'm sure this is keeping the city attorney awake at nights as well. Thank you.
Mr. Duncan? Helmets?
So DC just launched some shared mopeds. Are they covered under this policy or not? It doesn't look like they are.
No, they wouldn't be because they would be more than, well, they don't fall into the definition, I think, addressed in the legislation.
Okay. So if that company wants to move into Virginia, the state legislature is going to have to act to approve or not approve first. Right. I guess because mopeds are already permitted on the streets.
Right. But they would have to be on the streets, they couldn't.
Well, right, yes, yes. So maybe they could come in if they wanted to. Because mopeds are legal already. Okay, that's a whole other issue altogether. What about, to Mr. Z's question just about the behavior of the users, is there a way we can put into here that, you know, they know who's using them and they know where people are leaving them. So if someone leaves it in a place like his front lawn, is there a way to put a fine to the user from the vendor to try to regulate that behavior? Because I think it's going to be hard for the police to regulate where people are dumping scooters.
I know that some of the scooters, when you end your ride, they have you take a picture of where you parked it.
Uh-huh.
So I haven't tried to put it in an inappropriate place to see what happens, but it maybe we could ask them, like, that the ride doesn't end if it's not parked appropriately.
If it's not parked appropriately. I think that might be really helpful. I think one of the problems in DC is that people just are leaving them wherever they feel like it. And then if you're riding your bike across the Roosevelt Bridge, there's a scooter in the middle of the bike lane, and there's nothing you can do because you're riding your bike and there's nowhere to go. So I feel like we need to have something in here about some kind of regulating the consumer behavior so that they're following normal civil laws or normal best to everyone.
Yeah.
And the same with helmets. I mean, who's going to enforce that? Are the police going to be tasked with enforcing that? As they would with a bike?
Yeah, I think that would fall under their purview. The helmets would.
Okay. And Chief Gavin, because she helped with this, what did she talk about that at all as you?
So she had me add the bit about helmets, the reference to the city code. So,
okay. So then suppose Mayor Tarter rides one home from the Metro and parks it in his front lawn. His own front lawn. Out of the way. Is that a legal place to park it? Or would it have to be in one of these corralled areas? Yes, you have your own private corral. If it's not impeding the sidewalk, then it would be right. But suppose he parked his next door neighbor's lawn.
So
I mean,
private property owners are allowed to identify a spot for it,
Okay.
and then I would say if it's in his neighbor's lawn, and the neighbor notifies the city would notify the company, who would then have 2 hours to remove it. And then if not, the city could then relocate it or move it.
Okay. Because I just feel like with all the good intentions here, and there's some really good stuff here, and I'm so glad we've learned from our neighbors that the consumer behavior is the hardest part to regulate, because they're the ones we want to use it and to get the best out of it, but it's just so easy to be lazy. And then what about liability for the companies? Mr. Z also asked about that, but do they have to carry a certain amount of liability insurance?
Yeah, so insurance, I believe, is addressed in the MOA.
Okay. That's here. Okay. Oh, that's law.
I don't remember, but I can see if I can find it.
You don't have to find it right now.
Okay.
I can look it up, but that's just a question I have to make sure that
Yeah, so
that's in there. And
yeah, so there are insurance requirements as
Okay.
part of the MOA.
very good. Thank you.
Insurance on file.
Okay.
Mr.
Thanks.
Snyder?
So thanks a lot. I work in downtown DC, so I've had quite interesting experiences with all these vehicles. Let me point out one glaring problem. Allowing a motorized bike at 20 miles per hour on a sidewalk, that's a scenario that really concerns me. I think we need to focus on that. That's why we may want to, whatever we do, we may need to be much more fine about the types of vehicles operating under what circumstances. So that one concerns me a lot. The second one is I want to get at some of these myths that have been created by the industries behind this. One of the myths was, well, Uber and Lyft would reduce congestion. Well, the truth of the matter is they've actually increased congestion. Then who's using them? Well, they're actually taking away from transit rather than taking away from single occupancy vehicles. So one of the things I want to do as we move forward is really dig into the research, not just the myths put out by the industry supporting this, but rather what is the actual experience. So point number one, a real concern with a particular scenario, and that's the first one that occurred to me tonight, but there may be others. The second one is I really want some solid research on who's really going to be riding these, and are we simply converting pedestrians into scooter riders, or in fact we're providing a way for people to get out of their cars, which is one of the proposed reasons why this is a good thing to do. The third issue is I want to make sure that we're charging effectively for public infrastructure. Everybody who owns a car here or is a taxpayer pays for our city's infrastructure. I don't want to give the industries behind this a free ride the way Uber and Lyft are largely getting. So that's a concern to me as well. We're in essence subsidizing this in terms of the transportation infrastructure we're providing. So I want to make sure that I get an equivalent amount of money back so that I can provide the kind of infrastructure our citizens expect. Those are the three things that occur to me tonight. Oh, a fourth one. I need to know more about how this fits into the overall traffic laws. For example, if I go through a red light in a scooter, am I a pedestrian or am I a motorized vehicle? If I do all these other sorts of things, where do I fit within the traffic laws? And you see where I'm coming from is I really want to deter bad behavior, particularly if we're going to allow these things on sidewalks or places where motor vehicles are not traditionally allowed. I want to know more about that, the overall safety context, what laws apply to them under what circumstances. You know, again, it would be going through a stop sign, going through a red light, because frankly, I can walk across a red light and I'm not endangering anybody but myself. But if I'm on a motorized bike at 20 miles an hour, that's a different scenario. So these are the kinds of things I'd like to explore as we move forward. So thanks a lot. Good work. We got to get going. The state's given us a rare opportunity. We do need to do something. I think you've given us a good beginning. Carrie, did you have any comments about any of that, or we can develop answers later on as well?
Yeah, we can look at the fees, and North Carolina, in terms your comment about where these riders are coming from. North Carolina State did a study, so 49% of riders would have biked or walked 34% would have used a car, 11% would have taken a bus, and 7% wouldn't have taken the trip at all.
Kind of mixed results. Okay, not maybe what the sales would be, which is that, but interesting. Well, thanks for that, and that's a good beginning on the research. Thank you very much for that.
Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. So I don't think it's probably a surprise, especially not to Phil, that I've been a fan and looking forward to this discussion. So thank you for putting it together. I think I'll go into the premise similar to the CACT in that I believe it's just important to have mobility for all modes. And I think this is the newest one that's kind of emerging, and I think we should be a part of it, especially when you really can't prevent scooters from crossing boundaries, right? So one of my first questions is, besides the 10 miles per hour, how does the rest of the regulations we're proposing compare to our neighbors? Because I do think that given that neighbors have had pilots for nearly a year now, we should learn from them instead of starting with a different number. So if they've decided, hey, we piloted with 15 and we're going to 10, then clearly 10 is the right number to go with. Or we said 16 versus 14 should be the age, then we probably should go with 16. So are all these kind of the best practices that are emerging from our neighbors, or are they ones that they're starting with at the beginning of their pilots?
Let me see if I can find the age. Okay.
I think the other reason, the reason why I think it's also important is because I don't think riders are going to know the difference when they cross borders. If they say, well, gosh, Arlington lets me do it this way, and then suddenly I cross over into Falls Church and I'm not allowed, it's just a bad experience. It also could be dangerous too. And so it would be nice if at some point all of the region could come up with something universal. But if we're one of the later ones to adopt a policy, we probably should follow what has worked well or what people are adopting later on too.
I do know that some of the apps, when you open them, they display local rules, and then in the user agreements as well. So we talked about speed limit already. In terms of age, Arlington County has a minimum age of 16 years of age. Fairfax City had no age listed. City of Alexandria had no age listed. And then in terms of bonds and insurance, we were looking, it all looks pretty similar in terms of Arlington County, City of Alexandria, and Fairfax City.
And everyone requires helmets if you're below 14 or 16, or? You don't have to answer now, but I think in general, for that matrix of kind of policies against scooters, it'd be good to know, like, hey, we're going to be similar to these other jurisdictions. Because I think, again, it makes sense if we're a year later to follow what people have learned. I'd like us to consider 16 potentially. So the driving age is 16 here. I think scooters are as big of a responsibility as having an automobile. So I'd like to think about whether 16 makes sense. I read that, so it looks like we're allowing sidewalks except for 29 and 7. Are we allowed by the state to actually ban them on 29 and 7? And if so, I'd like to propose that too. I think both of those have way too much car traffic to encourage or even allow scooters on there. Especially at a speed limit of 10 miles per hour, I think you get squashed. Can we do it by ordinance when we adopt this to explicitly ban 29 and 7 usage of scooters?
Carol, do you know?
Road, yeah, on the sidewalk, fine, but not in the road. Okay.
Yeah, we can look into that.
Okay. I like the Vice Mayor's idea about fines really prevent bad behaviors. I think I saw in several other places they do that too. In Fairfax City, because in their recent rollout of the pilot, when Wyatt had introduced this topic to us, he was concerned about staff time and how much it would take to kind of monitor this pilot. One thing I saw in a lot of their user education is that people have issues or concerns, they contact the companies directly to really remove the staff involvement. So if you see a scooter abandoned and you're like, I have an issue with it, it's parking my lawn, rather than call the city and the city has to go figure out which one it is and call the company, they should just call the company directly. Because while this is a, hopefully a good thing to have in the city, I do think that we should not spend a lot of staff time governing this, because I do think that could be a lot of time if we don't manage it well. So if possible, I'd like to get the companies actually to monitor and police and manage bad behavior too, and put the ownership on them. Finally, expected revenues. I know we're charging kind of the usage fee and then the right-of-way, like per mile fee, I think similar to Fairfax City. What are expected revenues from this, and what are our plans for it? If we have any early ideas.
So we're planning to reach out to the companies and see which ones are intending to come here.
So just to leave you with an idea is, I would love to see whatever revenues, if we get revenues from this, to go back into mobility infrastructure. I read an article that I think Indianapolis took the money and paid for a bunch of helmets that were just available, and they just put helmets available for people, encourage use of helmets, or improve biking infrastructure that could be used for scooters. It might take us a while to build up enough money, but I think that makes sense that money from this should go back towards transportation infrastructure. And then finally, I know we're going to monitor the 25 scooters per company. I'd love to see that number figured out. Is it per capita or per square mileage? Just to figure out, feels like a good number to start with, but just so that we don't have that run away from us, to know, hey, for a city of our size, what is ultimately we think a good number to have based on what we're learning from other people. Because I think when you go to downtown Arlington, like in Roslyn, there's just so many scooters everywhere. You wonder, like, how do they actually ever get used? So I think they might have an overabundance, but it would be nice to, again, learn from what others have done, and if there's an optimal number we should get to. But thank you. Thank you for the good work and getting this underway.
Tillington House.
Yeah, so we can also, if Arlington has in their way, if the scooters aren't getting, I think it's like a minimum of 2 riders per day, they can go back down. So in the same way that we could, if they're getting 3 rides a day, they could increase the number. We could also put in a mechanism to decrease the number of scooters.
Yep. Carrie, thanks for your work on this. And thanks for your help on the West End grant, too. That was a huge benefit to the city. Does this cover Segways? I saw a guy riding around our neighborhood going door to door. I don't know what he was selling, but he was on a Segway going door to door with an iPad. That was like some next level. That's what I thought for sure. I was like, that's got to be Phil, but nah, he's a couple years younger.
I don't believe those fall into the definition.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That was just something. That was the first time I'd seen that, and I thought it was apropos for the meeting tonight. So I'm going to go back to the liability issue, because anytime I see us collecting revenue related to the use of the right-of-way, the comment that one of you guys had made about the sidewalks being uneven, that's been a particular pet peeve of mine down in the area of town where we live near TJ, because we've had some kids and some adults, I won't name names, that have hurt themselves riding the little scooters, the razors, around there because of the uneven sidewalks. I'm working on grinding and adding some other measures to prevent that. But this is a question for the city attorney. If we start charging the companies 5 cents per ride for a right-of-way, somebody rides one of these things, hits a ledge on the sidewalk, goes end over end, hurts themselves, is Lyft or Lime or Bird gonna call us and say, hey, we pay you guys for these trips, you guys need to keep better shape of your sidewalk? Somebody hurt themselves, so now they're gonna sue you, not us.
Well, I would certainly think we require some identification of contract with them. And I don't think the fact that they're paying us is going to change liability status that the government is.
Okay. I would see somebody arguing differently, but I'm sure we'd fight it regardless.
We would, in the memorandum of agreement, before they put any scooters in, they identify us.
Okay. I just want to make sure that before we start making them pay us for every trip to go down there.
Insurance, and we could be additional.
Okay. The other thing that concerned me was the cash bond of $5,000, which we effectively draw from to cover picking up scooters from people's front yards and storing them when they're not picked up. And I have seen a couple already stashed in bushes along Lee Highway down our end of town. Is $5,000 enough? I mean, Arlington, Alexandria, City of Fairfax, I mean, you had some information there on the size of those jurisdictions. One, they're more commercially dense, so there's going to be fewer opportunities in major throughways for them to end up in people's front yards. So we're inevitably going to get more calls about these scooters that are ditched in people's front yards as opposed to just ditched in front of a storefront. And two, we've got a smaller, which I would imagine this would fall on the shoulders of Public Works. This is probably a DPW issue if somebody calls and says, I got 3 scooters sitting in my front yard. Is that enough for us to cover that, given the staff resources that are going to be required to deal with that? Because I don't care if we do corrals, I don't care how much we regulate this, people riding one of those things home at 3 o'clock in the morning from Clarendon, they're gonna ditch them in places, and I just don't want to end up in a situation where it's more of a burden on us from a cost perspective.
The $5,000, well, for the other jurisdictions, they did a surety bond, but that was the amount that they used. But we could look at that and ask our GPW staff what they think of that number, if it needs to be increased.
And this pilot, is this for how long is this for?
12 months.
12 months. Okay, so if we find out that, hey man, we like it, but it's costing us a lot of money, we got to figure some things out. We're not stuck with having to carry the burden of a trailer truck full of scooters that have been abandoned on the side of the road.
Well, that's the thing. I don't want DPW picking these up.
I don't either, but inevitably it's going to fall. I mean, it's
the number they call is the company needs to go pick them up themselves.
Yeah, so
like,
so
They're going to call Wyatt.
Giant bumper
I mean,
stickers
that's
on there.
that's what it is. So.
yeah, we have the,
I'll go get them.
I think we're still
Device
going to
decals.
get, I mean, inevitably people are going to call. I mean, Bolster's way, man. They expect the city services to be the first line of defense for these types of things, and then we'll have to call them. But I just want to make sure, I mean, it's a 12-month program, so there's a chance to take a different tact, as things evolve. But I just want to raise that issue that $5,000 may not be enough. If they get a business license, are they going to be paying gross receipts tax here in the city for us? Is that what that? Okay. I don't know how these entities are set up with these guys. I have the same concerns about the speed on the sidewalks, given how narrow some of those sidewalks are, and the number of double strollers that are trying to creep between a utility pole and a wall to begin with. But I mean, listen, this is 2019; these things are coming regardless. And I, for one, am all about getting more diversity and mobility in this city to make it easier to get around. So I'm excited about it. Some cautious optimism there is probably a better way to describe it, but also a ton of work put into this. I didn't expect this level of detail. It was going to be more like broad conversation, but this is really well put together to be able to make an informed decision. So thank you guys very much for that. So thank you guys.
All right, I've got a couple questions or comments. I would.
Can I go after?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You want
No,
me to
go
go
ahead,
after
please.
you?
Just go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for all your work. I know there's a lot of detail here, but we're just at the beginning of a long journey. I'm looking forward to a robust community conversation about this over the next few months. And I think robust, based on my soundings in the summer of what people think, it's rare that a topic has stirred passions as intense as I've elicited from people with just an innocent question like, so what do you think about those scooters? They have the potential to change an historic characteristic of the city, the last mile, first mile problem that we have, because we routed the metro around us rather than through us. Now, maybe there wouldn't have been much left of Falls Church if we'd have routed metro right through it, but fact of the matter is we chose to do that, and therefore we are a suburb that wants to be more urban as opposed to Arlington, which really is, a city that has some county attached to it on the sides. And so there's a lot of excitement about that, getting people out of cars. The concern about, sacrificing mass transit is a real one, but getting people out of cars is such an imperative that I'm willing to take that chance. But it also has the potential, I think, to introduce a level of chaos and carnage that is unprecedented, and a degree of road rage and citizen unhappiness and phone calls to people who are elected officials and staff that we have never seen the likes of before, based on what I have heard people say about their experience in other jurisdictions, you know, from Alexandria, where scooter litter is all you can talk about, to Nashville, where the woman was killed and the mayor banned scooters. And I mean, just in the period of time that we've been examining this is a very volatile issue. On some specific points, I agree with Ms. Hardy, not on Route 7 or 29. I would like to vote for something that would, you know, run through these parameters. No on Route 7 or 29. Age limit should be 16. It is a transportation alternative, you know, just like getting your driver's permit. Helmet should be required, just flat. I'm not going to budge on that, because I'm not going to vote for anything that is going to scramble somebody's head when they hit a little bump and go, you know, boom, in a big bad way. I would ban them from sidewalks. You know, we're not building sidewalks here as a vehicle alternative. They're supposed to be for people who are walking or strollering, strollers being not a vehicle, but a means of carrying a kid. I'm not sure about the bike trail, but I'd be curious to know, you know, what are we going to do with electric bikes on the bike trail? If we're not going to allow electric bikes on the bike trail, we shouldn't allow scooters. If we are, then maybe that's where scooters should go. Not above 10 miles an hour, no dockless nonsense. They need to be corralled, but I accept the fact that they need to be more flexible than bike share. I'd like to be able to get a scooter, you know, at the stop sign in front of my house and ride it up to West Falls Church, not walk up to Founders Row and get a scooter and scooter it up to West Falls Church. And you know, in other words, that doesn't fully close the last mile, first mile problem. So I'm willing to be more liberal about where the corrals go, but you can't just leave it in front of, you know, the mayor's house. Yeah. No texting while riding a scooter. You know, in my home state of Tennessee, which is not known as being on the edge of progressive legislation, they've banned texting. They've banned any use of handheld phones in cars now. So when you cross the state line from Virginia to Tennessee, you just have to put your phone away. And it's weird to cross the other way from Tennessee into Virginia and basically enter a less restrictive or a more restrictive regulatory environment. So no texting. Weather restrictions and snow emergencies, they should not be allowed on the streets. Not after sunset. Don't want to have people riding those little things at dark. The taillights are worthless. We all know that. If you look at the vehicles, you can't even see the taillight. If you're going to ride one, you need to have a helmet that's got a light on the front and the back. The fees, as Mr. Snyder said, need to cover, you know, whatever infrastructure costs are involved, and you know, something about enforcement. I mean, the police are not going to want to spend their time flagging people down about not wearing a helmet or whatever, and yet that's exactly what we need them to do. So, like we had a parking enforcement designated police officer, I think we're going to need a scooter enforcement designated police officer. We're going to have to pay that person, give them a vehicle, you know, do whatever you have to do to train them. And so I think that is something. All these things are, you know, I mean, I appreciate the work that's gone into seeing what other jurisdictions are doing, but based on what the jurisdictions are doing, they don't seem to meet the higher standard that I think we should set here. We are a special place. You hear it every day. And we should have special regulations for this uniquely advantageous and disruptive means of conveyance. The overnight wranglers who collect these things and put them where they're supposed to be in the morning, who regulates them? What kind of noise are they making? Where are they parking? Are they parking in the middle of the street to load their trucks? What effect does that have on traffic on Route 7 and 29? If it's late at night, maybe it doesn't have any, but noise could be a potential. Rather than, you know, well, I'd like to see us try to determine which of these 7 companies is, you know, the most responsible and the most responsive, and give them the opportunity to come here, rather than just open the door and say, who would like to bid here? And I don't know how we determine that, but you all are smart people and probably can figure out which of the 7, if that's the number, is the best. And let's pick them. And let's try to make it not a pilot project, but, I mean, I know it's a pilot project, but let's try to make it a model for what other jurisdictions might do now that we've got enough experience in other places to see, what some of the problems are. I think that's all I've got for now. Thanks.
All right. I've got a couple comments. One, in general, I support adding additional modes of transportation. I mean, we're close to metros, but we're not close for some folks to walk or to get there easily. And so I do think that we need to address this new mode of transportation. I think we need to adopt a pilot. If we don't, the state's going to, regulate things that we might be able to do ourselves. So I do think we need to take some action on this. I do also think that we need to adopt some kind of ordinance in conjunction with this to regulate behavior with these things. And I don't know exactly how that would read. I'd look to a city attorney who I'm looking to right now, and over the coming months to come up with some ideas about regulation, about trying to ensure safety and the kind of nuances that the police might need to be able to prohibit dangerous behaviors. And I know that might be hard, You can't have law that's so ambiguous that can't be enforceable, but I imagine there's some things we could do in conjunction with allowing these companies to come in to ensure that our streets and sidewalks are as safe as possible. And so I suspect that having a separate ordinance that addresses behavior and what's criminal, what's not, or whatever you might want to characterize it as, would be appropriate at the same time. I do actually have some concerns. I know folks are talking about fees for this thing and that. I'm wondering if the fees are high enough to justify the staff time associated with collecting the fees. Because if you're talking about 5 cents a mile and somebody's going to collect $1,200, did you spend $2,000 of staff time trying to collect $1,200? And so I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd like a little bit of analysis of how much we're talking about, because if the fees are so small, it really may not be efficient to assign staff people to collect a very small amount of fees. So that's something I think we ought to be thinking about as well. I also think that we ought to have some regulation about shared. I've seen in other jurisdictions where multiple people get on a scooter. I don't know if you guys have seen that as well, but that strikes me as pretty dangerous. And so that's something that I think maybe could be a separate ordinance about, as I was just alluding to what's appropriate, not appropriate, not necessarily an MOU, but just for the actual riders as part of a misdemeanor ordinance or whatever it might be characterized as. Let's see what else I've got. I think that's probably it. I think this is a great start. I also just point out that, look, this is a pilot program. Are we going to need to tweak this thing? Yeah. A lot of the stuff we're talking about, it may be a good idea, maybe it's not, but I think we can feel our way through this and learn from other jurisdictions that people have suggested, but learn from ourselves and see how it works. If something doesn't work, let's change it. We got a year or thereabouts to do that. And so I think there are a lot of details and nuances that we can work through over time. So I just think getting this started would be a good idea. Unless there are any other comments, why don't we move to the second phase of our conversation? It's getting a little bit late. Mr. Shields or Paul, did you guys have anything you wanted to tee up as far as staff comments before we get to the actual discussion on these, the next item, the improvements, spot improvements?
So I think it was mentioned earlier tonight, 2014, when the council adopted mobility for all modes, which again really stressed that idea of not over-investing in just one mode of transportation, but investing in all modes of transportation to provide folks what's known as mode choice. That you can choose the mode of travel that works best for them. Driving, transit, walking, riding a bike, riding a scooter, whatever it is. Since that time, city staff has been looking at a lot of opportunities to fund pedestrian projects and bicycle projects. A lot of those opportunities that have presented themselves with grant funds. Grant funds come with their own costs and their own timelines. And so I think that it was the council's interest over the last budget season was to see something happen a little bit faster. $100,000 was set up in the city operating budget, the fiscal year 20 budget, which is what we're in now. So the $100,000 is available for use. The question was put to the CACT, what would you do if you had $100,000 to make a set of recommendations? Staff took a shot at answering the same question, and that's the information that is.
All right. Mr. Shields, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I would just add that the CACT did a lot of good work on this as well, and so they had made some suggestions on the use of these funds. They had sort of big areas of interest connecting orphan sidewalks sections, ticket drivers who fail to yield the right-of-way to pedestrians and crosswalks, repaint faded crosswalks, and that's the list on the first memo. And then they got more precise on the spot improvements with a bit more of a detailed memo. We met with staff, we reviewed this memo, we also did sort of a roundtable in terms of what staff was seeing out, complaints we've gotten, citizen requests we've gotten. And so some of the CACT recommendations, some of the orphan sidewalks are of a longer length that we probably need to go out and get grant funds or have
Thank you, Carrie.
bigger,
Great work.
have bigger chunks of money to close those gaps. So getting sort of to the point, we identified two pretty high traffic sidewalk missing sections that we would target the funds for. The first is at TJ Elementary School. Bless you. And there's a sidewalk section at the corner of Oak and Seton. It's about an 80-foot gap. With the acquisition of the Fellows property, hopefully we'll have more people walking to that park as well. But this is right on sort of a core Safe Routes to School corridor. We think that could be closed with a cost estimate of $45,000. And then on South Maple, there's a section on the south side of South Maple where there is no real way to pass at all. So you have to, if you're on that side of the street, you have to go out into the street. Once you get to the fish market, it's not a great sidewalk. The amount of dollars is not enough to get all the way to Wallace Street, but it would close this gap in front of the Henderson House. There's also been some stormwater issues there, and we think a sidewalk would help address those as well, keep the stormwater from going from the street to the private property. So those were two impactful projects that we recommended, and then using the balance to install handicap accessible ramps at locations where they currently don't exist. And there's one in Winter Hill, there's one at Annandale at Big Chimneys that may get taken care of at the Big Chimneys Park, but we just want to, that would be on the list to make sure that gets done. There's one on Van Buren where the WNOD comes out, or sort of a dirt trail off of the WNOD comes out on the sidewalk. Locations like that where we could put in ADA ramps where they don't exist right now. So that's where we recommended, and we'd love to have the CACT's reaction to that, feedback on that, councils. The goal is, because this is local money, we can get this work done more quickly than we can grant funds.
All right, thank you very much. So what do y'all think?
I want to turn it over to Paul, because Paul was the one who came up with the memo and he sort of put all of the recommendations together. So, I mean, personally, I like the staff recommendations. I do worry about the trees that are on. Would you be able to preserve those two mature trees that are in front of the Henderson property? If you were to put a sidewalk in there, would they have to come down?
They would have to come down.
I like sidewalks, so that's like trees.
I guess speaking for the CACT, thank you. Speaking for the committee, thank you for asking us. We really appreciate and note with a great deal of satisfaction the emphasis that council has been putting on walkability. In fact, it's quite noticeable. You're likely to say the walkable city as you are the little city, and that shows up, and it has become realized in day-to-day walking in the city in terms of pedestrian crossings, the traffic calming, the countdown timers on the lights. It is a safer and more pleasant place to walk than it was a few. So in putting together a memo, when we were challenged to come up with a list of ideas on what could be done to improve walkability in the city, we didn't get too hung up on the $100,000 because, quite frankly, we don't know how to cost out a project. What we attempted to do here is to give you a menu of what we saw as needed improvements. For sure, the needs are many and the dollars are short. But I think each of these is worthwhile in its own right. As to our reaction to what the city has proposed, again, it falls into that needs are many. The city is much more able than we to determine what can be done for $100,000. Any improvements we make are improvements we'll enjoy. But I'd be happy to talk about these in a little more detail if that's something you would like.
Okay, I mean, how about other folks on the CACT? Anyone else, any comments?
On our list or on this particular?
Well, just on the proposal that's before us tonight.
The staff recommendation.
Yes,
Yeah,
in
I mean,
comparison to maybe your own recommendations or your own personal feelings
My
about it.
personal opinion is the project by TJ would be great. That's a really high impact project because there's a ton of foot traffic through there and the school's right there. So that would make a lot of sense to me personally. The second project, I don't really know how much foot traffic is there. I'm a little worried about the trees. It's my initial reaction. But I know that we're really trying to make Maple more of a pedestrian-oriented street in the city, and so it definitely makes sense to use the funds that we have to make that get us on the way there, more further along in that regard.
Okay, other folks?
Yeah, I would just echo that in terms of the priorities. It's been a decent amount of time on South Maple, and I don't see a ton of traffic or a ton of foot traffic on that side of the street. I don't know if the city has any sort of measurements in terms of foot traffic anywhere, or if there's any way to quantify any of that in helping us sort of prioritize some of these. But I would, I think definitely anything that's in proximity to a school and then sort of in the core business area, I think I would recommend taking a higher priority.
Okay.
I mean, I agree with what has been said. Of all the schools that we have here, I think TJ is probably the most walkable one, just because of where it's located and just amongst the residents. And I would think that would have more bang for its buck and have a lot more an effect, and people would use that sidewalk a lot more than the other option that they have. So it just seems to make more sense of the two.
Okay, anything else, Sean?
I agree. Yeah. So I walk the office area, but the Maple already has a pretty good sidewalk on one side. The opposite side there, which I walk almost every day, and so while it would be nice to have one on that side, I hardly ever see anybody over there. And in terms of prioritization, I think TJ would be the best.
All right, other folks, council members, Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Yeah, I was ecstatic when I saw that these are the two recommendations and that both of these could be accomplished at 100,000. I mean, I live right around the corner from that intersection at TJ, and that's a dangerous intersection whether you got a ton of kids going to school or not. Visibility as you come up Oak before you cross over into Marshall, a corner is not good at all. And so having that other option on the other side of the sidewalk, so you don't have to cross to go down Oak up to Broad Street is huge. Frank, I thought it was something that I never quite understood how we ended up with that missing link, especially with the school there. But I could not recommend more specifically or broadly moving forward with that project. It's something that's 100% on point. The Maple, I walk up Maple all the time and down that section, and I see people that have chosen to walk down that section of Maple and then realize there's no more sidewalk, and then they're jetting across to get to the other side because they've kind of getting to that point of no return. So while it seems maybe insignificant, there is also from an urban planning perspective, small investments by a city in an area that you may want to see additional development in the future. Making a small investment to show that the city cares about the walkability of that area can actually spur commercial landowners to want to contribute maybe to a development plan for their own parcels. So there is some precedent behind making these small investments to show that the city cares about an area of town that has not been otherwise really looked at or focused on for development purposes. So I do see people walking there. I walk it all the time, even on that side in between that tree that you're talking about. But I think that that's a great choice, and for the cost, I think it makes a lot of sense to try to connect as much as we can on that side of the street. So again, bang for our buck. I think those are great, and I was ecstatic when I saw those two come across. the report that you guys put together. So thank you.
All right, other comments, Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. Yes, I'm supportive of those two sidewalk projects. I mean, we have 500 plus housing units in South Maple, so it'd be great to connect them to the core of the city. So those make sense. In general, I think prioritizing, as Dave said, the high pedestrian areas near schools, libraries, kind of the core commercial areas are good, but definitely no shortage of sidewalks. And so my question's a broader one is, how do we prioritize the next round? So I'm looking to next year's 100,000 or hopefully more. In the past, I brought up the idea of having neighborhoods actually compete for a pool of sidewalk money. Because in the past, when the city's kind of come down with a top-down recommendation of, hey, we're going to put sidewalks out, I think that was met maybe 10 years ago with a lot of concerns from neighborhoods. So similar to traffic calming, could neighborhoods, get everyone on board and there's a stretch of the street that needs sidewalks, compete for it and say, hey, we really want this, and we've got 80% of the neighborhood on board, and they compete for a pool of money as opposed to the city coming up with top-down. So food for thought. I'd love to see CACT's thought on whether that would be a good way of helping prioritize, because often I know the city gets caught up in trying to get right of way and easements to do sidewalks. And again, if the neighborhoods actually took care of that because they were all supportive, it probably makes the city's job much easier to actually make those sidewalks happen. So idea for the future is kind of some sort of neighborhood competition or pool to compete. I have a question. So if for the 100,000, if we can get these two sidewalks done to refresh crosswalks and other kind of spot improvements, are those things that we can take care of administratively, or do we need this money? Because I have a couple of things to add to that list.
We should be able to take care of those administratively.
Okay. I got a request today that at the WNOD there was some missing flags or crossings, I think,
Right.
today. North Oak and Northwest, I've heard from the neighborhood actually just today. I'm not sure whether that's through the NTCQ. Is Jeff Sykes still here? The status of that, or if that's just a crosswalk refresh or what's happening. They're really disappointed that the speed bump on Northwest isn't going to happen. And I think they've been in touch with Public Works on Plan B, but I just wanted to put that on there that if we needed to access this pool of money to help them, because I know that Northwest, and this is more Phil's area, has been asking for a long time for help, and that is at the base of Mount Daniel, so we do have a pretty active bus stop there. I would love to either look at safe routes to school using this money, but whatever the status of the Northwest North Oak intersection is, it'd be great if staff could look into that. CACT had brought up the striping of the downtown parking lot. I wanted to confirm with Wyatt that that won't use this money because that should be covered by the TOT.
Yeah, I think that's a good downtown sort of virtual bid activity. We do need all the property owners' cooperation there too, so that might take a little bit of time, but that's another source of funding for that project.
Okay, I just want to make sure we weren't competing against ourselves. So that one still should happen because we have separate money for that. But no, in general, I'm supportive. Maybe another work session we can actually talk about the NTCQ. So when I looked online, the last status update I think was 2017 and 2018. I know we had secured grant funding, a big lump that was coming this year. So I would love to know kind of from you all what's the next big sort of things we're working on, whether it's heavy or light solutions. Because we keep telling people that we have this great program, and I would love to be able to make progress on them too. Thank you.
All right, other comments? Vice Mayor Connolly, and then Mr. Duncan, and then whoever
Thanks.
else.
Thank you for two things. The recommendations I think are really good. I think they are both high traffic areas that could use a lot of help. In looking at the memo, this detailed memo that the CACT put out, I would really like to hold on to this memo and keep it because there are some very good things on here. That just this list of the sidewalks that need help. It's nice to see it all in one place, and it would be great to have some kind of checkbox of, okay, it was identified in 2019, when are we going to get to that one? Just to be able to follow along there. And there may be others in the city. Are there others that, right. So these are the ones that you identified as the top priority, but there's then a whole other list of more.
It's certainly not an exhaustive list.
Okay.
But
Exhausting, but not exhaustive. Do we have a list, another list, official list somewhere?
So we're putting together a map, but I think this memo is going to help. We can put this in GIS layers also for the missing link so you can see it visually.
Okay. And then I would really like to put in a plea for ped heads on West Broad Street at Lee Street, Oak Street, and Spring. At both Spring and Lee, there are traffic lights, but it's very difficult for people who are walking north and south along Broad Street to see when they can cross. And that intersection, the one that I'm most familiar with, is Lee and West Broad is very dangerous for pedestrians and drivers because no one can see which way they're going and the light is so far up, no one can tell when they're allowed to cross. So that one I find to be very dangerous. And then we had residents of Spring Street come and talk a couple months ago about their problems, and they identified the light there at St. James as also being really dangerous because the ped head, they go one direction but not all directions.
Sure. I will try to keep it quick. I think there's good news. I think the thing that could be talked about is timing. So the crossing at West Broad and Lee is included in an ongoing CIP project to improve pedestrian crossings all along West Broad Street. That was an award through the Smart Scale program, which is based on cost competitiveness. And as the city has seen time and again, when it applies for pedestrian and multimodal projects, it shoots right up to the top of the list because on cost competitive, you can't do better than everybody. So Broad and Lee is included in that project. The crossings at Spring Street, they are next to a school as well as a house of worship. There is a project scheduled in the CIP to update the signal at Broad and Spring, which would of course include full pedestrian crossings. The timing certainly at Broad and Spring will be a little bit slower than what the neighborhood's looking at, so it could be a question of good and intermediate be installed.
That's great, thank you. So what is the timing then on Broad and Lee?
Reminders across the room.
We'll get back to you on that question.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Mr. Duncan.
Can't tell you how excited I am to go to talk to the folks on Northwest Street for the, 7th time in 7 years and explain to them why whatever it is that they wanted hasn't been happening. So could we please do something that satisfies their needs? I mean, it's just, Founders Row is going to be a big development. It's going to generate traffic, and we've known about it for years now, and oh, goodness, we just need to do something about that. Second, Ms. Hardy's motion about let's update the NTC website information so that when I go tell people things that we think are going to happen, it's actually true. Mr. Baldino's list is excellent, and I would love to know what the price tag, even if it's just the back of the envelope, price tag would be to do each and every one of the things on this list. Because I feel like if you, put a $10 million bond out, let's just say $10 million, you could get to work on a lot of these things and get a bunch of work done all at once. Obviously, you'd have to go outside to get the resources, manpower, person power to do it. But, if we are committed to being a walkable city, we need to put our money where our feet are. And this is a good roadmap that teaches us where the money should go.
All right, other comments, Mr. Snyder?
So if I were prioritizing sidewalk expenditures, I would put at least one sidewalk in places of the city where there are no sidewalks. I would second put additional expenditures where there's high pedestrian use, namely the schools or the commercial areas. Third, I would put it where there are clear obstructions in the one sidewalk. Now, with regard to the missing connections, that may make a great display on a map, but if there are 2 or 3 people walking each day in that area, it seems to me that would not be a high expenditure. It seems to me that you would be best put limited resources where there are most walkers. So those are sort of the criteria. Again, I think the missing segments, if there are 2 or 3 people walking on one side of the street, why would you spend all the money to build a sidewalk on another side of the street if in fact that existing sidewalk is more than sufficient if you're dealing with a situation of reduced funds below what everything is you'd like to have, which is 2 sidewalks on every street everywhere. So that would be my suggestion. I like certainly the first. And I think the question is on South Maple, whether you've got the pedestrian traffic to justify the expenditure there or the expenditure somewhere else, perhaps where there are no sidewalks at all, or where you have clear obstructions in the way of the one sidewalk that you have.
Okay, Mr. Z?
So I'll just make it short and sweet. I think Ed Henderson, his heart of hearts, he kind of feels under siege from all sides, in particular the Asian fish market that he hates with a passion. And if you're going to cut down that tree in front of his house, it's going to be like taking away yet another bastion that shelters him from the ever-encroaching commercialism in the area. So I think you've heard a lot of... I don't know, have you asked him? Can we cut down the city tree in front of your house? Maybe he would have a comment about that. So instead of doing that, why don't you fix the area in front of Beto's Leather? Spend the $40,000 in lawyer fees and let's get that piece done. We've talked about that stretch in front of Beto's Leather ever since he thought about putting his little shack there. And it's time we did something about that. We ought to spend the $40K in lawyer's fees and get it done.
All right, as a lawyer, I'll second that motion. Just a few things I'd like to quickly say. I mean, one, I think many of us, if not all of us, have noticed the change in attitudes just in the last few years, I think, in this city about walkability. And I think you all have been a big part of that, so our hats off to you. Walkability really is a priority now, I think, in Falls Church, and I think it's great. Personally, I think it's a key to economic success. If you have a downtown that's not walkable, people are not going to want to be there anymore. You know, this is in the 1950s. People aren't going to want to drive 2 blocks to go somewhere. And so I think this focus on walkability is actually good for a lot of reasons. But I think it's good fiscally as well, just for the benefit of our commercial areas. And I think we have the potential to be incredibly walkable, the size of like a college campus. And so, you know, people want to be walking all over the place. And so I would love to find ways to accelerate some of these solutions. I know there's a lot of things to spend money on, and I know grants are difficult to come by. But, you know, seeing this list of all these things, every one of those, I want to do them tomorrow, you know, because like Phil, there's just so many things that are begging to be done. That telephone pole, I can remember years ago, I don't know if I mentioned this to Paul when we were on that committee a while ago, but I remember seeing kids on Columbia being pushed in the street, you know, a whole bunch of kids in one of those little carts because they couldn't walk down the sidewalks. There's a telephone pole in the middle of, and those parents would be aghast if they knew their kids were being pushed in the middle of a street. And so there's so many of those situations in the city, and we are banging them out slowly but surely, but it'd be great to find a way to kind of accelerate that. I think that's about all I've got. In terms of this right here, I would agree, I think, with most of what's been said. I think schools and commercial areas certainly should be our priorities, although the Maple Street is becoming more of a commercial area, and I think it's great to try to tie that in with the rest of the city instead of being kind of an island of development. But I do understand what's been said, and I can't say I disagree necessarily with it. Anyway, that's all I've got. It's getting kind of late, but if you guys have additional comments about anything in the city that's within your purview, I think we'd all like to hear it. Is there anything else you guys would like to add before the evening is done?
Which is every bit as serious as the Columbia Street one is what we have now on North Cherry. We've done a beautiful job with the traffic crossings at Broad and Cherry. Much safer, much easier to use. But once the people do it, and if they're attempting to get to the Jesse's Thackeray School or down Cherry Street, there is no sidewalk on the other side. And that sidewalk that exists with the obstructions is, in some areas, probably not even 18 inches. I mean, it is not unusual to see strollers pushed in the street on North Cherry, which is pretty heavily used now that we've had so much development just outside the city limits. So it's one I hope we'll keep high on the list.
I just had one thing going back to the scooters. I I know that DC had at the beginning was able to put particular geofencing around the mall and particular areas like that. So we may want to think about, are there areas of the city? I can't say we can geofence like everybody's front yard, but there could be, like, we don't want everybody parking right here in front of the town hall or something like that, and they can put that in their system to prevent people from parking it in particular places. And that's what they've done in DC. So you can't park on the mall, you can't park in front of the Supreme Court, you can't park in front of Congress. I mean, pretty obvious places. But when they first started, none of that existed. So people were putting scooters on steps of the Supreme Court. So that is definitely a way to manage that. So there must be, we have to put some thinking into, like, what would that look like in Falls Church City.
All right. Well, listen, thank you all for the fine work you've done so far, and there's plenty more to come. Why don't we take a short break, and then we'll reconvene in just maybe 5 minutes and try to bang out the rest of our agenda in a timely fashion.
How do you,
Around. I know it's a late evening for a lot of folks, so thank you for spending your time here with us. We're very happy to have you here. Mr. Shields, is there anything you want to say staff-wise before we get started?
We have a discussion tonight to really introduce an idea that is in application across the state of Virginia, and really this is a beginning of a discussion of its potential applicability here, which is the transfer of density of development rights from one part of the city to another part of the city, moving density away from areas that we want to protect and towards areas that could have infill redevelopment. One of the front side of it, I think, is very aligned with goals that we have. The other side of it, the density going into the residential infill areas, would open up a new way of land development that we're not used to. We do all of our residential redevelopment with a special exception, where we can really manage a lot of the issues. This would make that certain areas of residential redevelopment by right with this transfer of development rights. And so that will be new for us. But this is really just to have that discussion, introduce the ideas, and we'll have a great presentation on that. But as a setup for that, we also first have a guest, the director of the Northern Virginia Conservation Trust, Andrea Reese, to talk about this concept and how it has been applied throughout Northern Virginia before we have a discussion about the potential here in the city of Falls Church. Is that a good enough introduction, or would you all like to say a little bit more before we turn it over to Andy?
I think that's a great introduction. Just by way of background, this was a concept that the Planning Commission put on their work plan for this year. And we did speak to the staff did talk to the Planning Commission about this back in February. Since then, staff has also talked to the Tree Commission as well as the Environmental Sustainability Council. I think it was included in the packet. There was a positive letter from the ESC to think about the concept of TDR and how it can be applied in the city. As Wyatt said, there are potentially a lot of benefits to TDR, and of course what has to get worked out is the mechanics of what happens with it. So I really want to see tonight be a conversation about what does council like about the idea of TDR and how could it fit within the city in terms of the goals it's trying to achieve. Because remember, this could be a revenue neutral solution. This is something that you have a revolving fund set up, and the purchase and sale of development rights means the city can achieve a lot of different goals if the program is set up correctly. And so the conversation then is how would the program work? That's what the council will explore more, and perhaps staff will come back in a later work session with more details. I don't want to give away both presentations, so I'll stop there. Andrea, thank you.
Okay, is the microphone suitable? Okay, thanks. Thank you all for having me here to speak tonight. I am going to try to stick to 10 minutes, but I am getting a little tired because I have a 3-year-old, and normally we're all in bed at this point. So I will be doing my best. My name is Andrea Reese. I am the Conservation Director at Northern Virginia Conservation Trust. I know a lot of you are familiar with NVCT. You attended our luncheon back in March, many of you, and you've seen our work over the years. But what I want to be able to provide this evening is a background not only on NVCT as the regional land trust and conservation partner, but also to focus on conservation easements, because that is our tool of choice for land conservation, and I think is how we fit into the transfer of development rights program and a way that we can be of assistance to the city if you should move forward with this. So my role is to help bring in NVCT's new conservation projects and help build up those partnerships. So what I can speak to is the impact of urban land conservation and some of the strengths in working together. First, I want to say that, of course, thinking of protected land might cause us all to think of huge landscapes and grand vistas and Yellowstone and redwoods, and possibly not of Northern Virginia. And so sometimes folks ask me, why are you working to protect urban land instead of rural lands? And for me, the answer to that is that small urban lands touch the lives of a lot of people. They provide scenery, they provide natural buffers to development, they provide habitat for wildlife that bring us enjoyment and entertainment. They're places for outdoor recreation. And then there's also the sense of community and history that these places provide. The Scout Building in Falls Church is the one property in the city that NVCT has helped protect to date. And that's a perfect example of the way that brings history forward into the present and the future for that sense of community. So in the sense that land conservation contributes to climate resilience, to human health, to the ecosystems that sustain us, it is valuable in urban areas. And when we're looking at constrained urban spaces, we do well to remember that each piece of land checks more than one of these categories. It provides multiple benefits layered among each other. Having talked with Paul off and on over, I think probably about 5 years, I've seen that the city has a really strong positive vision for its open spaces. It's thoughtfully created, and it really shows how open spaces connect to the city's historic character. They're of value in the present. They carry it forward into a more resilient future. And I think that the TDR program that is offered for consideration is a way to help reach those goals, and again, a way that NVCT can be of greater service to the city. I want to give just a little more background about NVCT for those who may not be familiar with us. And I should also say that we do have one resident of the city represented on our board of directors. That's John Hopewell. So we do have representation. And we are a 25-year-old organization. We are stretched a little thin with 8 staff members because we cover basically from Harpers Ferry down south of Fredericksburg. But we try and be where we can and be of service where we can. As a land trust that's accredited by the National Land Trust Accreditation Commission, we have proven that not only are our projects solid, but that as an organization, we have the resources and staying power to uphold those conservation projects going forward. We have 3 main elements to our work. There is, of course, the land conservation and stewardship component. That's the first 4 of those items there, and it is the bulk of our program. We find that land trusts really are distinguished by that permanent land conservation and stewardship work, and it makes us different from other environmental organizations. But like other environmental organizations, we also engage the communities we serve with cleanups, volunteer opportunities, outreach, education, and then we also do some policy advocacy, mostly at the state level, since that sets the stage for most of what can happen locally in Virginia. But then also we do a little bit of work at the county and federal level as well. So this just sort of visually represents our work a little more, and I want to note that there is a wide range of tools in the land conservation toolbox. There are, of course, conservation easements. We'll get into detail about those. But in terms of owning land, assisting with land use designations, zoning, overlays, all kinds of policy tools, they all have their pros and cons, and they can have different incentives and mechanisms to mix and match and carry them forward. But again, the conservation easement approach is what aligns with the TDR proposal, so that is what I'm going to delve into a little more here. The essential parts about a conservation easement are that it is a legal tool, that it is a landowner's choice to engage in, and it is permanent. Easements, of course, can be used to mean just the term easement. You know, you have a utility easement and a right-of-way easement, and so it's a little frustrating to have a term that can mean all kinds of things, but a conservation easement does have those features, and that makes it a pretty distinct and powerful tool for helping protect land from incompatible uses and protecting those conservation features or attributes on the land. There are tax incentives for donated easements, and so that is the context in which a lot of folks hear about them. But also easements can be a regulatory process granted in exchange for a permit or as part of some other program, perhaps in exchange for grant funds. And so we can also work with regulatory easements. NVCT works mainly with donated easements, but we do have a small, steady number, really just every year, of prospects that are regulatory easements. So I just want to make that element clear about our program. When we are looking at how an easement protects land, and the attorneys in the room will probably recognize the bundle of sticks analogy for property rights. Not my analogy, also not my graphic, but property law classes have you look at each right associated with land as a bundle, and you can remove certain kinds of sticks. And so certain kinds of rights can be affected in a targeted way through a conservation easement. Typically the rights to divide the property, to develop to what would otherwise be full build out. Mining is prohibited in easements, and then there are also ways that you approach, okay, protecting this specific resource. The historic house can't be removed. The forested area alongside the stream needs to remain protected and forested. These kinds of very tailored restrictions that are written into the deed of easement. So why would a person do this? Or why would a community do this? Why work with conservation easements? When I'm talking with landowners, this is the kind of message that I share, that it really is about love of the land, about a home place that you don't want to see disturbed or divided. It can be a business decision to steward the environment and to have that be part of your business reputation. The financial incentives for easements are a huge motivator for many people. But all of these mesh together to help get a landowner to that desired end state with an easement protecting the land. And I think that that is analogous. It applies just as much to a community choosing its paths for land use. It's the same kind of decisions about the future of the city, of the place you care about, and how you'll invest sensibly in its future. When NVCT is looking at prospective easements, what are we looking for? We're looking for natural resources, historic resources, those kinds of community important sites, the opportunity to contribute land for public recreation. In Virginia, we do have to have consistency with the comprehensive plan. And then we also look at geographic factors, size, zoning, basically are there development rights to give up? Is this land large enough that it's going to support a natural resource that's present? Those kinds of factors. When we are bringing an easement through the process, we of course have board approval. We negotiate the deed of easement, all those transaction steps. And then at the time an easement goes to record, we do ask for a one-time gift from the easement grantor to support the future stewardship of the easement. What is stewardship of an easement? That's sort of the lower half of this slide. It's everything that happens after the easement goes to record. We are permanently in partnership with the landowner. We work to uphold the deed of easement and make sure its terms are followed. This stewardship role is what makes an easement more than just words on paper. It gives it meaning, it gives it impact, it provides that lasting difference that means that the donor and the original creators of the easement really do have the legacy that they choose. I wanted to get into a couple of scenarios that are compatible with the transfer of development rights program. Sort of the simpler one is easements are very suitable for historic homes. Typically what NVCT does is we protect the outside of the home, that the historic appearance should be maintained, but in the interior, of course, the home can be modernized, and you know, we're not there regulating. You have to have the original type of doorknobs or window panes or something. So it's more of that focus on the exterior, the scenic view, that community impact, and then the setting of the house in its lot. And then the other here is life estates. If someone is, if the owner of the property and the resident of the property are different, if someone retains a life estate and for themselves, for their children, whatever that scenario may be, that is also compatible with an easement. It's in some ways, in the practical impact, it's no different from doing a conservation easement on a property that has a tenant. So as you look at perhaps life estates being an exit strategy for folks who may be in the sending area of the transfer of development rights property program, just know that those are also suitable candidates in my eyes, in my program's eyes, for conservation easements. And then I also want to bring this back to protecting stream corridors. NVCT has experience with restoration of flood channels on our conserved land. This is a site that we own in Arlington, and you can see on the left a very badly eroded swale. We worked with the county to restore it. It now looks as it does in the picture on the right, and my understanding is this held up quite well during the rain on July 8th. I haven't been back out to the site myself, but our stewardship staff say that it's looking good. So in the sense that our program also works for restoration and maintenance of sites where we want to provide some stormwater management, then I hope that that shows that we can be a candidate for partnering with the city. With our capacity, our experience, including our experience with TDRs from a participant's perspective. I meant to get into that a little more. We own some lots in Stafford County that are within Stafford County's sending zone for their transfer of development rights program. And we are looking at moving through that process ourselves as landowners, in addition to having a few years ago been advocates for the development of that policy. So to us, this is exciting. It is a viable tool for conserving land. We'd be very happy to see it put to use in the city. So I hope that that experience combined with our staying power as a land trust mean that there might be a path forward together. I would be very happy to take questions. I think what we're going to do is just pair up our presentations together and then have questions, but certainly I really look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I really appreciate the chance to come speak with you today.
Thank you very much. All right, let's hear from staff.
So before I get into the PowerPoint, I just wanted to touch on a few points from the staff report. First, staff is requesting the work session tonight for council to provide feedback on the transfer of development rights proposal. As was mentioned, this was an item on the Planning Commission's adopted work plan. So looking to get council's feedback on the level of support for this program and interest in the way the proposal is laid out. And then also feedback on the questions that are summarized in lines 8 through 13 of the staff report. The city's 2040 vision is in lines 22 through 30 of the staff report. And of course, implementing that vision will involve numerous policies, programs, and projects. And staff sees the transfer of development rights as a tool that can help to support the city's 2040 vision, specifically as a tool that can be used to preserve historic structures that might be under pressure to develop, as a tool that can help to reduce flooding, and then also to expand park acreage. In lines 62 through 76 summarizes how this a tool would be different from the city's existing special exception process. This is a question that staff has gotten at some of the previous work sessions that we've had as we've presented the concept. And so the way that TDR is proposed is that it's intended to complement the SE process by providing a tool that would support smaller scale infill development on sites that would not be good candidates for the typical SE process. So the SE process is intended for larger sites and also for sites that are in areas where strong commercial uses can be successful. So as I mentioned, staff sees the TDR process on smaller sites, 1.5 acres or less. And then another point just to bring out is that it's anticipated that there would be no voluntary concessions coming from the TDR process, as the public benefit would be derived from the acquisition of open space, the environmental preservation and restoration, and the historic property preservation. So those are the benefits that would come from using the TDR program. And as was mentioned, there have been a few work sessions so far, one with the Planning Commission back in February. We've also presented the concept to the Tree Commission and the Environmental Sustainability Council, and are tentatively meeting with the Economic Development Authority in a work session on October 1st. So the presentation I wanted to go through now is going to talk generally about how what a TDR program is, what benefits it can provide to the city, and then want to open it up to get council's feedback. So as I mentioned, as I was highlighting some of the points from the staff report, there are a number of challenges that the city is faced with, such as the need to find tools to help to preserve historic structures within the city, that might be under financial pressures to develop or subdivide. Flooding has been a recurring issue within the city, so looking to find ways to reduce flooding, and then also the need to expand park acreage and increase park access to support a growing community. And so a transfer of development rights program is a tool that can be used to protect sensitive environmental areas within a community. It can also be used to preserve open space and to protect historic properties. And so the way a TDR program would work, is Andrea had mentioned, land ownership consists of a bundle of rights. And so the right to develop the land is just one stick in that bundle. And so under a TDR program, you would be able to take the right to develop land in one area of the community and shift that to another area in the community that has been identified as more appropriate for development, such as a revitalization district is one area that it could be done in. So it's important, and as we're looking at the transfer of development rights program, that the community takes a look at what types of community assets are important to preserve. So again, the benefits that could come from using such a program is that it could help to preserve historic structures that might be under financial pressures to develop or subdivide, properties like Tallwood that could come in and subdivide and have other residential lots being put in. It could be used as a tool to help to reduce flooding. TDR could be structured in such a way that the city would be able to reclaim some of the floodplain areas that were largely built out in the 1950s and 60s. And so that can help to restore the floodplains to its natural purposes and be able to reduce flooding in the areas. And then finally, it can also be used as a tool to help to expand park acreage and increase park access. There are three main components of TDR programs. Sending zones, these are the areas that the community has designated as having characteristics that it would like to protect. And so the proposal that we've laid out so far includes three main areas for sending zones. These would be properties that contain historic structures, properties that are either currently adjacent to parkland or have been identified for open space acquisition, and then finally properties that are within floodplain areas. And then in addition to the sending zones, you have the receiving zones. These are the areas where the community would be transferring the development to, and these could be areas such as the city's adopted revitalization areas. And then a third component of a TDR program is a TDR development bank. And this was a component that some of the other program administrators have recommended as being important because it can help to prevent fluctuations in the cost of TDRs, and it can also help to provide a level of liquidity and certainty in the market. As if it's happening in the private market, then you're waiting for buyers and sellers of the development rights to link up at the right time, whereas if you have the bank in place, development rights can be purchased from the seller when they're ready to sell. They could be stored in the bank and then available when a developer is ready to come in and purchase those. So that was the importance in looking at the bank. And we're continuing to get some technical assistance from Bolin Smart and Associates on how that bank would function. So this map here shows the potential sending zones. Looking to get further feedback tonight from council on this. In addition to the sending zones, it also shows existing parks and open space areas just to provide some additional context. And so again, the parcels containing historic structures are shown in purple on the map. Parcels that are adjacent to parkland or have been identified for open space acquisition are shown in light green. And then a floodplain as well as a little bit of a buffer area is shown in light blue. And then this is the potential receiving zones. And so staff sees currently has this laid out as 2 potential receiving zones. The first would be the townhome option, and this would intended to serve as a transitional area between the city's commercial districts and the existing single-family residential areas. And I do want to just note, as we were making some edits to these layers, the fields is shown in on green, and so that is not intended to be part of the townhome option. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that before we discuss that further. And then the other option is for condominiums, and these would be within the revitalization areas on lots that are smaller, that would not be good candidates for the SE process, either due to size limitations or locations. And so as staff was laying out where these would go, we're looking at parcels that are 1.5 acres or less as an initial area. As was mentioned, the TDR process is envisioned to be designed so that it can maintain a revenue neutral cycle, and so it would begin with some initial capital to the bank. And one strategy that could serve to get that initial capital would be to take some of the existing development rights from some of the city's existing parklands that are already zoned R1A. This is a strategy that Arlington has used in the past, and so that would serve to be the initial capital to seed the development bank. So the development rights could be acquired from the existing parkland, and then they would then be available in the bank to be purchased by a developer to get that cycle going. And so once those development rights are purchased by a developer, that would enable the city to have capital available to then purchase properties that are in the sending zone, so a floodplain area, a parcel that has a historic structure, or an area that has been identified as being next to a park or for open space acquisition. So the money would be available for the city to do that. And then for the developer that purchased those development rights, they would then be entitled to do a certain amount of residential development on a property within the receiving zone, but they would still be subject to going through the city's site plan review process and would be required to conform to the existing zoning as far as heights and building coverage goes. Another component that staff has considered in thinking about how the bank might function is that it could serve to be a natural valve or throttle to the amount of development rights that can be purchased at any given time by having a certain level that it will hold at any given time, as a developer could never come in and purchase more development rights than the bank currently holds. So that could be a component that the city puts in as they set up such a program. So at this point, I'm looking to open it up to discussion. There's certainly a lot more questions for staff to pursue and a lot more analysis that needs to be done, but looking to get council's feedback on the TDR program as proposed. Does the proposal preserve the right set of community assets, open space, floodplains, and historic structures? Are there other important assets that staff should be looking at? Or are some of these things things that the city isn't looking to prioritize with this program? In addition, what are the right receiving zones for the transferred development rights? And then what is the right scale or style of development?
All right, thank you both for those informative presentations. Quite a lot of information, a lot to think about. I believe I've done a number of easements with your predecessor, Mike Nardlilly. Was Mike your executive director many years ago? Okay, yeah, I'm a real estate attorney and work for developers in our, so I've had plenty of occasion to, I think, probably prepare your easements actually, or work with them. So anyway, thank you for your informative presentation. Why don't we just open it up to questions and comments? There's a lot to absorb. Ms. Hardy?
Thank you, and thank you, NVCT. I actually live across the street from the only NVCT property in the city, so I'm quite familiar with your work. So in general, I think it's very interesting and very new to us concept, but I generally support the idea of preserve kind of historic structures and minimize building in floodplains and really move density to where it makes sense. I think for me, the ultimate question is how much control do we get in the development in those receiving areas? And when I look at the chart on page, kind of lines above 71, it sounds like essentially it would be a by right development with only kind of site plan approval by the Planning Commission. The question I have is on line 75. So it says the development must conform to the height and coverage limits of the existing zoning. So for the receiving zones you've kind of identified, are there any of those that condos or townhouses could actually be done by right? Or would it require rezoning anyway, which is what we've been used to, having to do a rezoning paired with a special exception? And again, on that control, I think we're very used to having a lot of control and being able to negotiate a lot of voluntary concessions when we do big projects. And I get that the SE tool doesn't work for smaller projects and infill things that we wanted to do. So I'm kind of curious, in this, like, to apply this to kind of real life in Falls Church, does it require us to rezone any of these receiving parcels?
So the idea is that currently it would not be permitted by right, but through the TDR program, by purchasing the development rights, that would open up that use in those areas. If they purchase the development rights, they wouldn't be able to do it otherwise.
So going back to that map, I think there was probably some like T1s in there. Like in those T1 zones, people could build condos there without any special exception type approval from us. It would just be a site plan approval by the Planning Commission.
Correct. In general, zoning controls two things. It controls form and it controls use. So the zoning would still hold in terms of controlling the form of the building, and that's why it was called out: building height, building shape, how the lot is configured, still going through the Planning Commission for site plan approval. The use would provide more flexibility. So from the TDR bank, what people are buying is the right to put residential multifamily into that building.
Got it. Okay. I think I still need to get my head around implications of that, though. I think it requires a lot more thought, but thank you.
Mr. Lichtenhouse, then Mr. Snyder.
Thanks. Yeah, I've got some experience with, I also work in commercial real estate, have some experience with TDRs, but it's typically been on the commercial scale over in Maryland for some much bigger projects. So I was curious to see this applying to more of low density residential. Just to be clear, so I was looking at the floodplain, looking at some of the other potential sender properties, and am I correct in assuming that in this particular, or at least the way that you guys have conceptualized this, it's residential to residential, effectively? It's not purchasing of development rights of residential, finding a way to monetize that to add density to a commercial project?
It's residential to residential. One of the things we're looking at, as Shana, Ms. Schaefer mentioned, we're working with Bowen Smart on the economics, and I think the next step coming out of this work session, if we get a positive feel, would be to talk to some developers about what would they be interested in, because I think there may be a multiplier involved. So converting an R1A lot, which is intended for single-family residential, you could do a calculation of how much square footage could have been developed. You would want to figure out, do you need to multiply that into the same amount of square footage in a condo, or maybe more square footage?
So what happens to the property? So I look at the floodplain properties, because I had a conversation with Jim about this as well. Well, I don't disagree that, you know, the way things are heading from a climate perspective, that some of those properties that sit along our natural floodplain are probably, things aren't going to get much better. And so there's a question about, like, existentially, what do you do about that? This is a way to help solve for it. But effectively, when you're selling off the development rights, you've effectively sold off the future value of the existing property, correct? So if you're selling off development rights that are banked for properties along that floodplain, since we're talking about purely residential, what do you guys envision as the future of those properties, right? So if I'm a homeowner and I own something in the floodplain and I say, okay, I'm going to sell off the development rights, I'm going to sell it to somebody, or sell it to the bank may sell it to somebody else. And I'm sitting on my property and you're passing it down from generation to generation. I mean, there's no future value in that. So what happens to that property? Does it become blighted? Do people just stop caring about it because there's no future value associated with the potential redevelopment of it?
So if it's something in the floodplain, then I think the expectation would be that the city, through the bank, would purchase the property, potentially granting a life estate to whoever's there if it's their desire to stay on that property through their lifetime. And then that once the current residents move out, the city would take control of the property fully, the house would come down, and then I think maybe long-term what you're looking at is maybe a picture similar to what Andrea showed with a restored floodplain, functioning stream. You could also do a trailside park along it, thinking about places like Lover Run Park in Arlington, Gulfstream Branch, bigger parks, obviously not on that scale, but something like a Rock Creek Park has a biking and jogging trail and a biking trail running through it. During a heavy rain, it floods. That's okay, because no one's using it during a heavy rain anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I would just ask to think about this from a practical perspective. I mean, I like the idea of more of like the spot acquisition to send and receive the TDRs, but when I think about it along the floodplain and because this is more purely residential, when you're effectively extracting the value early of a piece of property, there's not much incentive to take care of that property necessarily. Especially in a floodplain situation. So you may have a situation where we're land banking properties in hopes of reclaiming that area and turning it into something that is much more attractive. But in the meantime, you end up with just an area stretch in the buffer in the floodplain zone with houses that are falling apart to some extent. So just to think about that. The other question I have as it relates to some of the other potential sender properties. Are the development rights themselves, if they're coming from what was an exempt property, and I looked at some of the historic structures, one of them was the Falls Church, and I believe the other one was St. James. Those are one of those listed which aren't paying property taxes, correct? They're exempt. So when if you potentially sold off the development right of an exempt property, how does that work? Is that development right become taxable? And I guess that's a question for anything. Are those development rights taxable for assessment purposes? You're just selling off future value? Carol's nodding her head.
It's somewhat complicated. I know Arlington's had a big lawsuit over some of the development rights that have been sold, but the statute does provide that the development rights are taxable to the property from which they come until they go to another property to be used.
So I would just raise that issue because two very large purple parcels there are or exempt properties that could monetize the development density on that site, have it sit out there for somebody to take advantage of it, and it's effectively a free transfer that's worth a whole lot of money that is not taxable. So I would raise that issue for anything that falls into that category that's exempt. What is the taxability and assessment protocol for exempt properties selling development rights? So generally speaking, TDRs, I get it. Thank you guys for putting this together. I'm a big fan of trust and stuff. I enjoyed that lunch. I sat next to the woman that actually designed your logo. Yeah, she was great. We had a great conversation. It was nice. So thank you guys. Those are the issues that I would that I would raise for us to think about. But I like creative solutions.
All right, Mr. Snyder.
Thanks a lot. So I think you've already heard some questions tonight, and I have some more. It would be very helpful for the staff in the future to present a more balanced briefing. I do advocacy work all during the day, and what we're getting is a one-sided advocacy, which has merit. But I want to know, what are we going to face if we go forward? There are some jurisdictions where they've talked about breaking through the zoning ordinance in order to permit more dense development in residential areas, and that didn't go real well in some of those jurisdictions, rightly or wrongly. So one of the things I want to know more about is have a more balanced approach. Where has this been tried? What are the costs? What are the benefits? What's been the public reaction? I'm interested as well in more of a development on the historic property scenarios as to how that could be applied. I think of some folks here in the city, not me, but others who might be interested in this. So I'm interested in more, what would an historic preservation scenario look like? How has that been applied, and when would you apply it? So I'm not negative toward the concept, but I'm trying to get a more fuller understanding of what happens if we move forward on this as proposed, where are the things that we can learn from past failures so that we don't repeat them. I'm also thinking about taking the scenario that I've actually heard, where in essence you use the bank, the developer fronts the money, you buy the land in the floodplain, you basically take it off you eventually then destroy the building on it. The current owner is basically bailed out by the developer's payment at market value when they probably couldn't get that at all because they're in the floodplain. And then the developer gets the right to build what? Where? I think that's the fundamental question. Are we simply transferring more dense development from one place to another, thereby adding to the impervious surface? So we're sort of creating more impervious surface as we're eliminating stuff from the floodplain. So there are some environmental trade-offs here that I'm interested in pursuing. What I'm trying to say is I need to know a lot more. I want to be supportive of this, but I want to see more scenarios of benefit, not just that one. And then I want to see what are the potential downsides and what's the potential negative reaction that we're going to get. And then we may decide to go forward anyway, but I want to learn more about that. I feel somehow like I don't think this ought to be on a particularly fast track right now until we gather some more information, but it may be something we want to pursue, and I'm particularly interested in this whole issue of conservation and how we incentivize more and more of that, and totally supportive of the idea of that kind of thing. So that's just sort of an initial reaction.
All right, other comments? Go ahead, Mr. Z.
Yeah, the ESC Entry Commission, between the two of them, they heard this and discussed it and debated at 3 separate sessions, and then among themselves. And the letter they wrote kind of reflects a lot of the thinking that's taken place already tonight, which is, when you transfer development rights, it's what else goes along with that. It's not just the right spot themselves. It's probably a whole attendant set of things that get put into place, and so they also recognize it could be very much a multi-generational kind of thing. And then they were also concerned with the impact on the special exception process, which is a big one for all of us, and And so that gets down to the issue of scale. You know, we're small and so we're not talking about hundreds of hectares of forest land. We're just talking about really small things here. It goes kind of to Ross's point. The timing of doing something is obviously has to be very careful. We have abandoned houses in the floodplain and really old people living in the remaining houses, and then on the other side you've got a whole set of condominium townhouses springing up on Park Avenue. So it's something that requires consideration, and I don't think anyone that's listened to this is convinced that it should be on a fast track. There's just a lot of unanswered questions. At the same time, it could be a pretty powerful tool to shape the city going forward. And I'm sure Phil, as he talks about this on the campaign trail, will come back with all kinds of feedback about what people think about it.
Mayor Beth Connolly?
Thank you for that presentation. This is a big concept, and I agree. We need a little more time to process it, learn more, and answer those questions. My remaining question is about the life estate. Is that something that needs to go through TDR, or is that something we can move on sooner? I mean, do we have to have an ordinance to be able to do life estates? Have we done life estates?
I don't know that we've researched it as a separate issue, that the mechanics of how you offer a life estate. I think the issue is that you have to have something to exchange for it. So what the TDR offers you is that you buy the land now, and as part of the purchase, you grant a life estate so that they can continue living on the property.
Right. I'm just thinking about specific pieces of land that we have in the city that are adjoining a park or adjoining a school that we might really have a desire to purchase someday, but the person who's owned the house for 40 years still lives in the house, isn't ready to move. Is that something that we could start to pursue as an idea?
I would suggest that that's a good strategy for acquisition that's outside of the TDR program.
Okay,
per
so that's
se.
a separate.
It's simply a negotiation tactic, because that could be a real winner for everybody if that's desirable. So I think that's the way that it's viewed.
So we could move, if there were certain properties that we, the Recreation and Parks Committee has asked over years to purchase different pieces of land, and we have, or near Thomas Jefferson Elementary or near Jesse Thacker, or other places where we might be interested in purchasing pieces of land, we could move ahead with that, on that, without having to have a
Yes.
TDR in place.
A life estate is a concept that's used all the time and with wills and trusts and estates and all, but it just, we haven't used it in a zoning context, but we could certainly use it in land transfers when we're negotiating with somebody.
Okay. There are several pieces of land I think we should look at that for soon.
Okay, unless anyone else has got any comments, I got a few. I mean, I hate to say this, but I actually have some serious reservations about this program, this plan. And I think it probably has limited applicability, and it very well has some applicability, but maybe not as much, at least in my mind, has been proposed or suggested tonight. And I'll give you a few reasons why. One, as I understand it, the program would be essentially by right. In other words, they wouldn't have to go through the special exception process, which causes me significant concern. I think that oftentimes when things are allowed by right, there's unintended consequences. People don't understand the potential impacts in a neighborhood or wherever this might be. And so I really think something like this should go through a special exception process. In Arlington, TDRs go through special exception process, and the county retains control over, the sending, the receiving site to basically ensure that everything's compatible. As it's proposed tonight, as I understand it, there'd be limited supervision of the transaction or the transfer, and as of tonight, I'm really not sure exactly how it would work. In other words, I'm going to give up one house in the floodplain. How many units might I get? Well, I got a 10-unit condominium building. That, to me, causes a lot of concern. Maybe 10 units aren't applicable where it's going. Maybe it's not the right parking, or I don't know what might be there. But that I'd like to be a little involved in, just like we are with any other proffer negotiation or community benefit negotiation. What's appropriate for the community? What are the trade-offs, et cetera? And so that gives me some concern. I would also say in general, TDRs, at least in my experience, work better in a different type of zoning where you have FAR-based zoning or units per acre zoning, so that you could say, the zoning ordinance gives you 40 units per acre. If you do this TDR, you get 50 units per acre. We basically have a form-based code where you fill up a box. You know, your box is your height and your setbacks, and you fill it up with stuff. And so it's kind of hard, I think, to have TDRs without that basic parameter of how a zoning ordinance works. I could be convinced otherwise, but on its face, I have some concerns about that. I think it works best in the other in that type of zoning. To the extent this is applicable, I think it really needs to be tightly tailored, and I'm not really seeing that tonight. I think there is a place. I would love to see cost-effective ways for us, particularly to buy floodplain property, because I think it's a good thing to do, and I think that's where we need to end up. But it's very expensive to buy a whole bunch of houses up. So I think it has applicability there. I do also think that we want to incentivize certain behavior, but not all the behavior. For example, most people who live in historic houses don't need to be incentivized to not tear down their historic house because they like living in a historic house. And so they weren't about to go tear it down, but it could be a windfall to somebody by saying, please don't tear down your historic house. I'll give you a pot of money not to do what you weren't going to do anyway. I mean, Dave, you're not going to tear down your house, right? You got a beautiful old house, but if someone offered you a couple $100,000 to not tear down your house, who knows? But so I think we have to be we have to tightly tailor what we do to incentivize only the behavior we want and not more. And so particularly with historic properties, the churches, I don't see them about to tear down the church and put up property. So in some ways that's a windfall to a church, which may be okay, but if they're not paying tax already, it may be something we want to give some additional consideration to. I'm trying to think what other points I have here. I don't think it's something that we shouldn't continue the conversation on, but I wanted to let you know early on, at least the concerns I have at this brief presentation and my brief review of the staff report. And I have had some offline discussions with a few folks as well, but I do think that we need to spend a whole lot more time on this before it's ready to be adopted or approved. So that's my last 2 cents. I don't know if anybody else has got anything to add to that.
I would just add, that's why I said not me.
Well, you could drop that cash of $100,000 that address I can give you on a slip piece of paper. But on the other hand, it could be a backdoor way for the plan director to move the city toward an FAR-based paradigm.
I think that the quasi-form-based code has served the city very well in terms of setting up the form and structure and urban design of commercial corridors. I don't think there's any interest in folks.
Well, I do have a big interest in that, and this place will never grow up and be able to achieve these kinds of things unless you have a more modern set of regulations and guidance. So I would emphatically disagree with you.
Let me not participate in that, but let me add, the Council of Governments at their retreat had some very interesting discussion of how within the existing form you can actually do multifamily, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Minneapolis? You're talking about the Minneapolis model?
Yeah, well, that was, I don't know if that, but there were some images that I thought were sort of interesting, so you might be able to find some acceptability in the neighborhoods for that sort of thing. Anyway.
I do think for me one of my major concerns is I don't really understand what the trade-off is. So I've just taken one single-family house has certain service costs, whatever number of people are going to school and the other service costs, and now I've allowed maybe potentially dramatically more density on somewhere else in the city. And so to me, that's a big trade-off, and I don't know how that plays out. In other words, we're talking about units in here, a 20-unit condominium building. I don't know how exactly that works. But that seems like a substantial windfall to somebody potentially. And also the service costs are kind of hard to prospectively know what they are. And so again, that sort of goes in my unintended consequences bucket.
I agree. I think some of the big questions that we had as staff, that we knew we were going to have to answer for ourselves coming out of this work session, were what does that look like in terms of when the bank buys a property, how much can be built somewhere else? We had done some napkin math with a few folks early on. Then we hired Bolin Smart to look at it initially. And I think now we're actually going to go test it with a couple of developers and say, look, if you could do this, how would this pencil out for you? Because if it doesn't pencil out to the city's benefit, then I think there's probably another way to go acquire those floodplains. The other things we wanted to look at are the mechanics of it. How does it legally work in terms of how does it fit inside the zoning ordinance? And I think the question about what did this mean in other communities, how has it been received, how has it been utilized, I think those are all good questions to ask, as well as tightening up the definitions. Can you transfer off a tax-exempt property? How many rights can you sell off of a parcel with a historic structure? I think those are all questions that we either wanted to ask or coming out of tonight, we're going to bump those up on the priority list.
Well, we're not constrained by any state law or regulation in this regard, are we? We can make it up as we go along. For example, the suggestion of actually, you take the rights away from a single-family house, let's say zone R1A, or several of them, say 5 in floodplain, and so you now have a sizable asset, and then the question of multiplier. So, is that 3 times much floor area ratio, or whatever it works out to be, or you pass through a set of filters, obviously, and this goes back to the special exception process you're talking about. I don't think we'll ever make anything by right here because we're just so small that you just can't afford to make mistakes along the way. But so my fundamental question is, as a legal entity, we can make these things up not make things up, but we can have a construction that is not impeded by any state regulation.
There is a good amount of flexibility in how we create it. I mean, the state does have guidelines of how you do a TDR program, but within that, in terms of multipliers, things like that, there is a decent amount of flexibility in how you create it. And the key is going to be to find something that will work for people and that will work for the city and will actually achieve the goals we want to try to achieve.
All right, unless there's any other questions or comments, thank you all for coming out. It is a really complicated project or proposal, and so we appreciate all the hard work you put on it to date, and I think you've heard some constructive comments, and let's see what we can do to move this further along, but I think it will be a lengthy conversation.
I like this.
All
Put
right.
this like Proposition 8 in California, Vote yes on TDR.
All right, well, listen, thank you all for coming out. We appreciate it. All right, what's the last thing we got here? Is this just updates on stormwater?
Yeah, Council, I just wanted to provide a very quick update on work in the stormwater area. And I'm going to start with sanitary sewer. The task there is to prevent inflow and infiltration into the sanitary sewer system. We have ordered watertight manhole covers. We'll be installing them in the month of September. So people, for instance, on West Columbia Street should be seeing those go in the month of September. We also will be doing our fall sewer lining project, which we do every year, and we'll have more information on that. We are putting together a draft policy, which we'll bring to council very shortly, I think at your next meeting, at your next work session, on a proposal for a backflow device program that would be very targeted for certain neighborhoods, and it would be basically a financial incentive or help for people who would like to consider that for their home. We'll provide some technical guidance and also a financial program. That money would come out of the sanitary sewer fund, and it would be a portion of the fund that we use to prevent inflow and infiltration into the system. We can't get it all, so we want to, in a targeted way, protect those homes that have been victimized by that. So that's just a quick on the sanitary sewer side. On the stormwater side, we have finalized our top-ranked engineer that would help us with the prioritization of projects We have a meeting this week with them to go over their final scope of work and also have a discussion with them about the process that we would undertake with them to study potential solutions to problems and what the public involvement of that should be. And we want to get a little bit of discussion about that, of whether we should do some of the engineering work and the budgeting work up front before we engage with the task force group. The engineering kind of needs to stand on its own two legs, but the prioritization and how dollars are spent, that may be the proper area where the council would like to have a group do some pre-vetting of those before those proposals come to the council, so it's not just entirely staff-driven in terms of the recommendations on projects. The issue there is, in stormwater, there is so much to be done that we do need to prioritize where we can make the biggest bang for the buck. There's really ultimately some judgment there, and some of those decisions are going to be somewhat subjective. We want to make it as disciplined as possible and engineering-driven as possible. At the end of the day, there's going to need to be some community decision making on that. So I expect in 2 weeks we'll have a report back to council on how to stand that citizen group up and what the time for that would be. The overall goal is to have recommendations to council by the time that you adopt the budget, so that we can discuss the financing for it and get projects underway. And for that whole scope of work, I'm talking about the potential for some larger projects. We also have a pathway for smaller scale projects, just to kind of put a number out there, projects that are in the $10,000 to $50,000 range that can be handled by the Stormwater Fund. We can do the engineering in-house and do the work in-house. That's on a separate track. We want to do those on a faster track than the sort of bigger, the large project track. This is what's on the wall. There's a picture taken today. This was a blown out wing wall on Trips Run. The wall went out on July 8th, and we needed to get that wall repaired because if we'd had another flood, it could have dug into that bank and taken the houses down into the river with the volumes that we had. Yeah, it's essentially a dry stack, very heavy stones. You can't really see what's put in there, but they're not gabions. It's a engineered stone, effectively, that locks in together, so its own weight holds it together. But groundwater can actually penetrate through it, so it won't cause ground problems for the property behind it. Yeah, so the Cavalier Trail is the staging area for it, but it's upstream from Cavalier Trail. Well, then the properties will have their own drainage problems and things like that. So we... I need to get back with you on that. I'm not sure what those. I think that actually is the next course that's going to be laid on top of that. Yeah, that's what locks them in.
Right. That's the bridge at Seton Lane there. Or Sharrow.
Sharrow. That's right.
It's the bridge at
That
Sharrow.
is correct.
Okay.
So this is we're looking upstream, and that's the outfall just below Sharrow Avenue.
All right, any comments, questions, Mr. Snyder?
Just real quick, Wyatt, thank you for moving out on the manhole covers and the backflow. Very, very good. I think in terms of prioritizing, prioritizing the sewer backup cases and situations is number one. The engineering sounds good, but I really think that if we get an engineering report, I'm not sure we need to necessarily wait till the next budget process, but rather we can look at the stormwater fees, whether they're adequate to do what the stormwater system was set up to do in advance of that. So I don't think we should artificially delay that particular decision.
Yeah, there's as Mr. Schneider knows full well, and I'm sure the city manager does as well. So regionally, there's a huge discussion on the kinds of weather events we've been having and the pressure on stormwater structures in all 29 jurisdictions that form COG and the kind of repetitive high-intensity systems that we've been having. And so we're hearing from everybody what are some solutions and things we can do in the near future as opposed to long term. So I'm sure you have that in mind, and will inform your efforts with whatever government structure we finally end up doing.
Vice Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Shields, for that update. I'm wondering about some of the small projects that can be done in-house. Is there a list of those that's going to be provided to the community so people know that theirs is going to be taken care of?
Yes.
Okay, and that should be out like this month or?
Yeah, let me get back on the timing of that. But
Okay.
the intention of that is that's a faster track.
Right, okay. So we'll know, because in the stormwater meeting that we had, we heard about Laura Drive and Hillwood and
Those are the
West Columbia and others.
things we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Rain events, this is not about longer term, but I mean, I know when a hurricane comes through, we get a little lead up, but the July 8th event was, I don't know, I didn't feel like there was much lead up to it. We just had kind of an unexpected storm, so I'm not sure what we would have told people to do. But in the wake of that, is there anything special that we are communicating to people in the event of predictions of, 3 inches of rain in a short span of time? Do we have like a toolkit that we pull out
Sandbags.
and say, get your sandbags, clean the leaves out of your gutter? I don't know. I don't even know what I'm suggesting, but I feel like we need to tell people something. Don't leave your house, I mean, be at your house because maybe there's something you can do.
Well, I mean, I think the thing.
Or evacuate your house. I mean, there were some people who were like trapped in their basement.
Sell it to the land bank.
I do think that.
Shorter term. Yeah.
So one other deliverable is to provide homeowners with guidance on things that they can do. And so building up risers around your window wells, an extra layer of another stair at the top of your stair going down your basement. These are things that people need to consider to have their own homes be resilient. And those who have done that, say, in along Sharrow Avenue, had a much better experience than those who had not. And so neighbors should talk to neighbors also and learn from each other. But we will have one-pagers on those. We've got one now on the backflow devices, the risers. Those are can be kind of home-specific, but the basic idea is look around your house and find out if there were 6 inches of water in your yard, would it get into your basement? If so, then protect against that.
Just something simple as get the crap out of your basement. I mean, I don't know. It just seems to be happening with such frequency that people need to be more mindful.
We did go for, so 2011 was a big event, and then the last year we've had a large number of events, but we did go through that about 8-year period where we had lots of storms, but they were kind of your normal storms of 2 inches of rain in about an hour, and our system can handle that. It's when you get faster than 1.5 inches an hour where things back up.
All right, anything else? All right.
And what about working with Nova Parks on the bike path engineering,
Yes.
WNOD engineering?
So that's going to be one of the ones that's on the big list. But yes, we are in touch with the Park Authority. They have not yet started their preliminary engineering, but the discussion of stormwater will be front-loaded in that engineering discussion.
One more specific question, Laura and Poplar. There, the inflow into the storm sewer system is about that high. Is there any work going on with regard to looking at that?
Yeah, that's an operational issue. There are some other things. We're not convinced that's really going to solve the problem. So there are some things that would not be in the big list that goes through the committee, but that shorter, faster list of things that could be done there. If we do dig up and replace that pipe, which these are the types of things we'll also consider, and that would be kind of in that bigger engineering list that would get folded into the CIP. There may be some lower cost solutions, however, that make that not necessary. But that situation just specifically is also a situation where the pipe goes diagonally across the lot, and the homeowners have wanted for years for us to move that pipe. And so if we were to consider a more significant project, it's an old pipe, undersized. We would also relocate at the same time. So those are things that we would need some engineering behind, and that gets into a higher cost project as well. So that would be in the big project group.
And just one.
Confusing in my response. There's some strategies, and that specific thing, it might be the fast track ones, and then there's bigger ones that could be in the.
Yeah.
Don't you have a Goldilocks category? It's not too small, not too big, but you get that done.
So I think collectively, this is an example of the city working very hard to deal with circumstances that frankly we didn't create in many cases as a result of national decision-making. So even as we work to solve our local issues, hopefully we're not going to forget that this is part of something much larger that needs to be addressed.
All right. If that topic's done, scheduling, I think, is the last item, right? Is there any scheduling or council requests?
I've been away for a little bit. There was a retirement ceremony for a crossing guard, which is going to be on the 26th. Could we just get that on the calendar? Because I think we're going to have to move the EDC meeting if it's the time that it said that it was going to be. So if you could just put that on sounds like an important event that we will all want to attend.
Yes. That's Janet Haynes' retirement.
Yes.
September 26th. Yeah.
That's a 9 o'clock event. So
9 o'clock would be it's kind of the more, St. James wants to really drive the bus on that one, and then at 10 o'clock it's going to be broader.
okay. So that means we probably would do the EDC meeting that day at like 11 o'clock or 11:30 or something. Anyway, just let us know when it will all be over so we'll know when we can begin.
Anything
And,
else?
The only other question I had was about Railroad Avenue. Not tonight, but I just drove by there today for the first time since I went out of town, and I can't figure out what the heck is going on. So if you could just give us an update on that at some
So
point.
one thing you had asked, what is the concrete thing in the middle? What that is an edge that will be the edge between the grass pavers and the asphalt. So it's a good, that's the way you want to build that. What's being done right now is the base foundation for the paving. So asphalt will go on top of that by the end of this week.
Everything, I mean, there were trucks and everything was ripped
And the
up down
grass
to the dirt.
pavers go in as the last thing.
So it's the idea that the strip down there it's not a barrier, it's a separator, if you understand what I'm
So
saying.
you'll be able to drive right on top of that.
That's what I'm saying.
It's not a curb.
Okay, it's not a curb, it's a separator, okay.
All right, Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Thank you. This weekend, one of our citizens, Peter Clark, had approached me and asked me to raise the issue with city staff as to whether or not the boxwood trees in the median on Lee Highway outside of Rosemary could be relocated for better visibility and to create a safer turning environment. He said that he had raised that issue once before. I don't have any other specifics aside from that. But it did tell him that I would raise the issue specifically tonight at our work session. So that is Peter Clark's request to look into moving those boxwoods in the median of Lee Highway to make it safer for turning off of Rosemary.
All right, any other requests, Ms. Hardy?
I think it was about a year ago that we heard from Lincoln and Great Falls about crossing that intersection and crossing to Lincoln Park, and then people ask for tree trimming and bush trimming. That just reminded me. I just want to make sure that it's the time of year to do that again, so that we, now that we have kids back at school and playgrounds, so wherever we have crosswalks with things obscure, it'd be great if we could do a full city bush trimming.
But we
All right.
need the citizens to do their, very often these are citizens' bushes, and so they get a letter. Those that are ours, we will.
Yeah, so if we can send a letter, that's fine too. And then my request earlier, but I would like to go back through the NTCQ, because I have heard from, for example, Lincoln, I think has been on that list for a while now, and we promised them some things after what we did at Meridian, but I think further up Lincoln would like more work, and Annandale and Gundry, I think, has been on the list for a while, and so maybe separate work session time to talk about that.
And
One other thing, RCN franchise agreements, Andy, I see that's on the bottom of our list here. The only reason I ask is because I understand that RCN and Masson are in a contract dispute, and RCN subscribers in town can't get the Nats games, which is too bad, because tonight they scored 7 runs in the bottom of the 9th inning to win a walk-off game against the Mets. But why is that? I mean, why would you not carry the main? Anyway, what's our deal with the franchise people?
That piece I can't speak to, but the franchise agreement is due to be renegotiated and upped. And now that I'm shortly not going to be the HR director, I'll be able to get back to RCN is due now, and Verizon is due in 2021 or 22. So both of them we need to update and model after what we did with Cox. RCN has a very small footprint in the city, so about
Just
500 accounts.
One of those footprints just happens to be my mother-in-law. So
Yeah.
all right, anything else?
With them right now on the school as well.
There's a rumor that there's going to be a book signing by the author of the book that was handed out to everybody here on the 14th of September. Fall Festival? Okay.
There's an early one, 9 o'clock in the morning at George Mason High School. And then she'll be at the Fall Festival signing books. And then she'll be at Thomas Jefferson Library? Or Pimmitt Hills Library. She'll be at the Pimmitt Library in the afternoon.
She wrote the book,
Yeah. Yes.
I read the book, actually. On vacation. You don't have to
Out of
be on
local
vacation to
references.
read the book. You ought to read the book.
I'll forward this, but for your calendars.
It's a fast read. It's a fast
Falls
read.
Church is hosting their kickoff event at the downtown park next Monday, 5:30 to 7:30, with free ice cream from Little City Creamery and music. So, Hannah Jordan just sent this to me. So they're holding their kickoff event for Welcoming Week, I think, which I think culminates in the signing on the 14th. But they're hosting it at the downtown park. So it's Monday night. I would ask you, Mayor, if you wanted to speak. If you wanted to welcome people.
It's got free ice cream.
It's
They
free
just
ice
need to
cream.
just perk up, they'll be there.
And it's good ice cream.
Well, let's adjourn, Mayor. I move to adjourn.
I move it too. Let's move out of here. All right, thank you all. Good night.